Before we start, please observe the following online safety rule guideline. Please ensure that you are seated according to the ergonomic position. Check your chair to ensure that you are comfortably seated and there are no damage to your seat. Please set your laptop and smartphone lighting to medium or moderate to prevent eye fatigue and strain. Please observe the rules of 20-20-20. After 20 minutes focusing on the screen, move your focus to any other object around 20 feet away and focus to that object for 20 seconds. After that, please come back and continue with our session. Please set the sound level of your laptop or smartphone into 50% of maximum capacity, especially when you are using headphone or earphone. Please ensure from time to time you will engage in stretching. In between session 1 and 2, there will be 5-minute breaks, so please stay tuned.
I don't know whose that was.
Welcome to the Publishing in High Impact Journal webinar series 1 and 2. Assalamualaikum warahmatullah and good morning. Professor T.S. Dr. Salmia Kasolang, Rector Universiti Teknologi Mara, Cawangan, Pulau Pinang. Associate Professor Dr. Hashim Fadhir Arifin, Head of Center, Faculty of Hotel and Tourism Management, Universiti Teknologi Mara, Cawangan, Pulau Pinang. Our speaker for today, Associate Professor Dr. James Eric Gaskin, Brigham, Young University, United States of America, and Professor Dr. Noel Scott, University of Sunshine Coast, Australia. Professor, Associate Professor, Doctor, lecturers, and all audiences. This international webinar is jointly organized by Faculty of Hotel and Tourism Management, Universiti Teknologi Mara, Cawangan, Pulau Pinang, with ESTEEM, Journal of Social Sciences and Humanities, Universiti Cawangan, Universiti Teknologi Mara, Cawangan, Pulau Pinang, by Faculty of Hotel and Tourism Management, Universiti Teknologi Mara, Cawangan, Pulau Pinang, with ESTEEM, Journal of Social Sciences and Humanities. This program is now live streaming via YouTube UITM channel, Universiti Teknologi Mara, Cawangan, Pulau Pinang, media Facebook Rasmi. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia Professor T.S. Dr. Salmia Kasolang, Rector Universiti Teknologi Mara, Cawangan, Pulau Pinang, to deliver her speech. Please welcome.
Who is it we're looking for?
Sorry, okay, I will begin again. Thank you so much, Dr. Wan Rusni Wan Ismail as the moderator. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wa mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'. The Honorable Associate Professor Dr. Hashim Fadil Arifin, the Head of Center Faculty of Hotel and Tourism Management, Universiti Teknologi Mara, Cawangan, Pulau Pinang, Malaysia. Distinguished esteemed speakers, Professor Dr. Noel Scott, University of the Sunshine Coast, Australia. Associate Professor Dr. James Eric Gaskin from Brigham, Young University, United States of America. Respective committee members, fellow academicians, participants, ladies and gentlemen, and of course to Dr. Anderson as one of the key person. Again, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Peace be upon you. In Bahasa Malaysia, also we say Selamat Sejahtera. Yeah, Alhamdulillah, let us extend our sincere gratitude to the Creator, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, for giving us this opportunity to be here today. On behalf of the organizers, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to this Publishing in High Impact Journals webinar series. This program is part of the pre-conference webinar and workshop series for the International Joint Conference on Hospitality and Tourism 2021. And it will run from May to July 2021. It's about 3 months. Now, this webinar is jointly organized by the Faculty of Hotel and Tourism Management, Universiti Teknologi Mara, Cawangan, Pulau Pinang, and our university journal called ESTEEM, Journal of Society, Sciences and Humanities. The main objective of this pre-conference webinar and workshop series is to provide an avenue for academics and students to gain research knowledge and skill that will be of exceptional value. This objective is in line with the common aspiration of higher learning institutions worldwide to equip academics and students with relevant and up-to-date research insights. Ladies and gentlemen, in Universiti Teknologi Mara, or UITM, we strive to be among the top university not only in this country but in the world. Now, our vision is to become a renowned university, and it is not an easy job. So, as a staff, as a lecturer, we have many functions. One of them is teaching and learning. Second is in the research matters, and there's so many things associated with research matters. First is we need to find grants. We need to apply for grants. And then once we have a grant, we need to find postgraduate students. Then we need to, once we have results from our research work, we need to publish them. And then some of this research output should be turned into a patent, yeah, or it is a copyright. And then even better, some of these research products has to go to commercialization. So there is a long chain when we talk about this research output. And what we're going to do today is actually to strengthen one of these ability to publish, not only publish, but publish in the reputable journal. So this is one of the initiatives that we do today. To achieve such a daunting mission, I don't call it daunting mission, but it is like a challenging mission. It is a very, I think, good mission. It will produce many good things. Publishing research papers in high impact journals have always remained one of our utmost essential priorities. Concerted efforts are put forward to improve research productivity through regular seminars, workshops, and other research-related activities like what we're having now. Although the current COVID-19 pandemic has generally weighed down research productivity, various initiatives were taken to motivate academics and students to continue writing and publishing during this challenging time. And perhaps, I think if we really plan it properly, we're going to have more publication this year, despite this pandemic. An excellent example of such an initiative is this Publishing High Impact Journals webinar series. The advancement of internet technology is a great blessing as it allows us to gather safely on this virtual platform. We can meet and meeting people from all over the world, yeah, from Australia, from the US, from Thailand, and so forth. Today, we are very grateful to have two prominent international speakers who will be sharing their invaluable knowledge and expertise in publishing high-impact journals. Both of them are involved in high-impact journals. Yeah? Alhamdulillah. We are delighted to have Associate Professor Dr. James Eric Gaskin and also Professor Dr. Noel Scott. Yeah? Talking about the United States of America, I have very fond memories of studying there for my bachelor's degree in agricultural engineering. in agriculture engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from 1990 to 1992. The university is located along the southern shore of Lake Mendota in the city of Madison. It's very cold there during the winter time. Those are the things that we will not forget. Ladies and gentlemen, we are also pleased to have with us today participants from our conference partners, National Institute of Administration and Development, Thailand, King Mongkut's Institute of Technology, Lat Krabang, excuse me for my pronunciation, also from Thailand, and Forum Program Study Pendidikan Tata Boga, Indonesia. Welcome, everyone. Once again, I would like to extend our warm welcome to all the speakers and participants. I sincerely hope you will find this webinar rewarding. I'm confident that the objective of the International Joint Conference on Hospitality and Tourism pre-conference webinar and workshop series will be met, and that all will benefit immensely from this 3-month program. Stay safe and may you have a fruitful webinar. Before I end my speech, I announce the opening of publishing in the High Impact Journal webinar series. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you to our beloved Rector, Yang Berbahagia Professor T.S. Dr. Samia Kasolang for her opening speech. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are blessed to have Associate Professor Dr. James Eric Gaskin from Brigham Young University, United States of America as our speaker. But before we invite him, I would like to present a brief introduction about the speaker. Associate Professor Dr. James Eric Gaskin has published over 160 peer-reviewed articles in over 40 different journals and conferences across 15 disciplines. Currently, he is the guest editor for Journal Association for Information System and also an associate editor for both Frontiers in Psychology and Association for Information System Transaction in Human-Computer Interaction. Currently, his work has yielded over 5,000 plus citations with 30 high index. Please welcome Associate Professor Dr. James Eric Gaskin to deliver his talk on methodological issues in quantitative research.
All right, my cue, I can just go. I have an hour. All right, I'm not very formal, so here we go. Let me share my screen with you. By the way, hello. I'm glad to be here. Let's see. I can share this one. Share. You should be able to see, I think, my PowerPoint there. Yes. Excellent. So I was initially reached out to and asked to speak on publishing in high impact journals, which is what I prepared for. And then they found out that I do some statistics, and so they asked if I would talk about statistics also. And so I'll do both. I saw that the topic of the whole session is about publishing in high impact journals, but neither Noel or I were asked to speak on that topic in the end. So I'm going to speak on it, and I'm going to speak on quantitative methods a little bit, and I hope that's okay. So first, how to be a prolific scholar. I've had some success. I'm not terribly old, and I've published about a paper every 3 weeks, which is insane. But I only work about 30 hours a week because I have 4 daughters and I've started 7 companies, and I have other things to do. I have a yard. I have to do, weed my garden. And so there's a way to be prolific, is what I'm saying, without having to kill yourself doing so much work. There are ways to avoid so much rejection, or to turn rejections into opportunities, or to make your revision more likely to be accepted. And there are strategies. It's not just all luck and numbers, and there are strategies to be more prolific. And it's not just garbage stuff I'm publishing either. We publish in the top journals, my co-authors and me. And a lot of it is because of people like you who reach out to me and say, I have a great idea and great data, and I'd love to work with you. So I'm going to talk you through some of that. There are lots of things you can do, lots of strategies you can take to be prolific. We're going to talk about each of these briefly, and then we'll get to some quantitative considerations that you also asked about. So first, there's this awesome paper called Avoiding Type 3 Errors. You've probably heard about, but maybe not memorized, because nobody's ever going to quiz you on this. What is a type 1 error? It's a false positive. That's when you think something is there, but it's not. A type 2 error is a false negative. It's when you don't think something is there, but there is something there. And a type 3 error is false science. It's when you have a bad research question, or you just didn't do things right. And so you're trying to put effort and time and resources into a project that's just not going anywhere and shouldn't go anywhere. And so there's this great article by Arun Rai. I hope you look it up. It's in MIS Quarterly. There's a link here. I sent the slides to Andy, and I don't know if those can be redistributed or what, but there's a link in here. And it's a great article especially for young scholars going through their doctorate, but also for young scholars who have obtained their doctorate and are still trying to figure out the best way to not waste their time doing research. So I've advised a lot of doctoral students. I've been on a lot of doctoral committees, dissertation committees, and one of the questions I always get asked is, well, how should I start? How do I come up with ideas? How do I know if those ideas are even any good? How should I know whether to put energy into doing this research? And I know some of you who are even experienced scholars sometimes think about this and think, is this idea any good? Should I spend time on it? And so there are several questions I wrote down in the StatWiki. Some of you might be familiar with the StatWiki. If not, there it is. It's statwiki.gaskination.com. And there are some guidelines in there for how to start every research project, in my opinion, purely my opinion, but it's served me well thus far. And I'm going to talk about each of these briefly. So the first is, when you're coming up with an idea that you want to research, or if somebody presents you with an idea, you need to ask, what is the problem that you're trying to address with that research? In fact, as I've been an editor and been a reviewer many times, the number one problem I see with manuscripts that are submitted is that they don't identify a problem. They just say, there's this confusion in the literature, or there's a gap in the literature, or there's inconsistency in the literature, or it sure would be nice if we understood better this area. But what's the problem? Like, are you saving somebody's life? Are you saving money? Are you making money? Are you making new things? What's the problem you're trying to address? If there's no problem, why are you spending time on this? Who cares, right? You've read that article, Who Cares, or What's Interesting by Davis. If there's no problem, you probably don't need to do research. And if you're just having a hard time articulating the problem, go talk to a good friend or a good colleague and just talk about it over lunch. And you'll arrive at a problem, or you'll arrive at the conclusion that there is no problem, and so you should just do something else. One of the main issues I see in a lot of problem identification in submitted manuscripts is they treat a gap in the research like a problem. That's not a problem. That's just sort of a symptom of a problem, or maybe a guidance to a problem. But a gap in the research isn't a problem. Just because something hasn't been researched, or because there's inconsistency in findings in research, doesn't mean there's a problem we need to address. So don't be misled by looking at the gap. The gap is important. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need to have a problem you're pursuing. Also, one thing I see especially in young scholars, particularly doctoral students, is they have all these problems they want to address, and they have this domain they're fascinated with. Let's say it's customer satisfaction in tourism, right? Something like that. And it's like this massive field, and there's so many problems, and so they want to address all of them. You can't. Stick to one. Keep it simple. If your paper is simple, that doesn't mean it's stupid. It doesn't mean it's inadequate. It means it's focused. Focused is good. How many times have you accepted to do a review for a paper and then looked at the page count and thought, oh, dang it, this is 80 pages long. Ugh. Or have you ever gotten a review and it's like 15 pages long and you're like, sweet, right? Easy, I can do this. So do your colleagues a favor and keep it focused. One problem. And then what do you do if you can't even come up with a problem? What you can do is think about the domain you're interested in. Some large domain like information security, or like I said, customer satisfaction, or something like that, brand awareness. This is a large domain. And then think, what are the pain points within that domain? What are the things that are causing issues that are leading to lost money, lost satisfaction, lost customers, lost wellness, lost anything like that? And those are the problems. Now, go figure out which problems have actually been addressed or haven't been addressed. But that's how you start. Look at the pain points. And if you're at a total loss for ideas, go to conferences like this. Go to your most popular conferences and look at the track descriptions. And that will tell you what other people in your field think are interesting problems right now. These are the domains that are of interest, and within them, you'll see problems listed at those conferences. That's a good way to find problems. Beyond that, beyond identifying a problem, you have to explain why it's actually an important problem. You can't just be like, hey, here's this problem and trust me, it's important. You have to convince the reader, who is the editor at the time, right, and the reviewers, that the problem is wasting resources, either money or people, right? Or it's contributing to resources, or not. And again, money and people. Or it's changing experience, which again leads to money and people. Try to figure out how your research question, how the problem is affecting money and people, and include that in your story in the introduction. Usually when I do a review as an editor, I read the abstract and then I read the introduction, but I spend probably 60% of my time in those 3 to 5 pages. The rest we can figure out. I assume you did your methodology right. I assume your findings were more or less accurate. I assume your lit review is more or less complete. I'll look at your discussion quite a bit, but it's the setup. Tell me why this is a problem and why that problem is important, and why you need to address it in this journal. Why is it relevant to the conversations taking place in this journal? Because even if it is an important problem that no one has researched and it's timely, if it's not relevant to our journal, why are you submitting it to our journal? So it's got to have a good strategic reason to be there. Anyway, other problems that are important are ones that enable new things to be done, new affordances, new opportunities, new features, new capabilities, new abilities, new markets, things that create opportunities. Those are interesting problems to pursue. And the problem is we're missing out on these opportunities. That's the problem. And if we were to address this problem, we'd have new things to pursue. And that's one way to frame it. Or from a more theoretical perspective, does it enable us to think differently, addressing this problem? Are we stymied, prevented from thinking beyond our current paradigm because of this problem? And if we address this problem, can we then think in different ways? That's an important problem to address and often overlooked, but is more theoretical contribution. Here's another one that I see from doctoral programs where the advisors are maybe older, got their PhDs a long time ago. They think about the problems that were interesting when they got their doctorate and when they were being really active in research. But those old problems don't always need to be rehashed. I received an article from a top journal, and they asked me to edit it. And the problem was a problem from like 30 years ago that had been thoroughly fleshed out and figured out. And we know as much as you can in science, we quote unquote knew the answers, even though there are no like proving and answers in science. It's all just more opportunities to explore. So there was no real reason to do this research. They did an amazing job. They had crazy good data, but they wasted probably 3 years of their lives working on a problem that had been already solved, addressed 30 years ago. So as soon as you identify a problem and figure out why it's important and relevant, you got to figure out who else has addressed it. And that's another big thing. I just reviewed a paper yesterday, and they said, this is such an important problem, and if we figure out this problem, it's going to make everybody's lives better. And then they just moved on to the next part of their paper without saying who else has actually addressed this issue, because very rarely has no one ever addressed your research question. You're smart, but you think similar to other people. You are human, and you've been trained in an institute of humans. And we all think somewhat similarly. And so if you think you've come up with an idea that nobody's ever thought of before, I'd like to hear it. And I bet you're wrong. You might be right, but most likely you're wrong. So who else has addressed this problem? And I don't mean specifically, I mean generically. One thing I get occasionally, here's an example. Let's say you want to study something like virtual reality adoption in a Malaysian secondary education context. And you can say in your paper, no one has ever studied secondary education in Malaysia from the context of, from the point of view of virtual reality. And that might be true, but maybe they studied it in Europe or America or China. So what makes Malaysia different, right? I mean, there has to be a theoretical difference in context to justify additional research. Because if they're not different, then the findings are going to be the same. And if they're not the same, then maybe there's some other issue. But you need to justify, if you're going to do something that someone has already done, you should probably justify why the effort needs to be made if it's already been done. Now, different fields are different. Some fields appreciate replication, such as medicine, physics, some of the hard sciences really appreciate replication. In some of the softer sciences, social sciences, like tourism, like my field, information systems, psychology, replication is not looked upon favorably in the top journals. You try to publish something there that's pure replication, they'll be like, meh, what's new? And they might not publish that. And then if you've identified who else has addressed this stuff, you need to explain why what they did was not enough. Because again, why do we need to do this research? Your whole point of the first 2 to 3 pages of your paper is to try to convince me, the reader, that this research needs to be done and that you did it, right? And that's why you did it. So why did you do this? And once you identify why you're doing this, you need to explain how people who have already addressed similar questions, how their research was not enough. And so again, why you need to do your research. And you have to be very careful here. A juvenile mistake that I made as a young doctoral student was I said, you know, we're studying this research question and these other guys have studied it, but they totally missed this and they had flawed findings and their assumptions were all wrong. And you have to be really careful. My doctoral advisor said, ooh, no, these are my friends. I know these guys who you're saying did bad research. And guess what? They're going to be the reviewers on this paper. And so if you say that their research was bad or incomplete or flawed, then they're going to reject your paper. So you need to be very careful about how to frame prior research as incomplete. It's better to say you're going to extend these prior research instead of correct them, things like that. All right. Other considerations, how are you going to go about doing your research? Again, from a young scholar or an eager scholar perspective, I want to study something amazing, something incredible. And I want to understand how hotel CEOs go about decision making. Well, you can try that, but how are you going to get that data? How are you going to go about studying that? That's going to be impossible to get hotel CEOs to pay any attention to you. So important considerations. And who's your target population? Similar idea here. How are you going to get people to give you data? If you're doing it in that way, if you're doing data from people instead of archival or something like that. And can you get enough sample size? And this, of course, leads into methodological considerations. If you're doing a quantitative study versus a qualitative study, there are different sample size considerations, and we can talk about that as we get into that topic. Regarding rejection, as you can imagine, with 100, whatever it is, 60 plus publications under my belt, I've been rejected a few times. I've probably been rejected about 300 times. That's my guess. And so at first it was tricky. You know, you get your PhD and you think, I'm like intellectually elite, right? I'm one of the smartest, or at least most educated people in the world. I'm in the top 1% of intellects in the world, right? That's how you think when you're getting your PhD. You're like, oh, I'm super smart. At least that's how I thought. Good old American attitudes in individualism. And so when I got a rejection, it's like, well, that's very personal. They're saying I'm not smart enough. Clearly I'm smart enough, so they're stupid, right? They don't know what they're talking about. And obviously you gotta be careful with the way you react to rejections, because they're coming for you hard. If you want to be successful, you need to get rejected a lot. So if you want to avoid rejection, there is a way. You can prevent some desk rejects. That's when you submit a paper and it doesn't even make it to a review team. The editor says, no, thank you, we don't want this here, and doesn't even send it out to reviewers. So there are ways to avoid that, or at least to decrease the likelihood that that will happen. Here are some strategies I've used. First, get early feedback from someone you trust. Usually not me. Get it from your advisor, get it from your advisor's colleagues. If you're already a professor, get it from your colleagues. They love you and trust you, and they want the best for you. It's in their best interest for you to succeed. So they'll be honored that you trust their intellect enough, you think highly enough of their intellect that you would ask for their feedback. So it's usually not a burden, but you can also make it not a burden by not giving them a whole manuscript, which you shouldn't be doing anyway. If you have a whole manuscript written out, you did it wrong. You should be getting feedback way before that. And so what I typically do is I write what I call a bullet abstract. It's just bullet points of the argument. And what is that argument? Well, it's usually, sorry, I'm gonna make you dizzy here. Oh, here we go. It's usually this. I just answer these 4 to 6 questions in bullet points, and I send that to my buddies. And my buddies can, within like 3 to 5 minutes, they can say, oh, that's what you want to research. That's stupid. Or, oh, that's what you want to research. Somebody else has already done that. Let me send you their paper. Or, oh, I know a guy who's doing something similar. Let me connect you with them. And it takes them 3 to 5 minutes. And you just added so much value and saved so much time. You didn't spend a month, 2 months, however long it takes to write a 40-page manuscript. Instead, you started from the right position. There's this, sorry, a little distracted. There's this saying, if you start an airplane going 2,000 miles and you're off by 1 degree, when you land, you're 200 miles away or something like that, by 1 degree. If you can change the position of your trajectory at the beginning of a project, you have a much better likelihood of hitting the right target than if you try to go all the way down to the end and then move your destination. There's a lot more movement going on, a lot more effort going on at the end than at the beginning. So get rejected super early is what I'm trying to say, or get corrected super early. If you send your paper to your buddy, not the paper, the bullet abstract, and they say, oh, this has already been done, well then great, you just saved yourself 3 months of work. go move on to something else. Okay. Work with smart people. Again, not me. Work with somebody else. I love working with people, but for the most part, don't send me your stuff. I get people sending me their data and their ideas every day, and I reject most of them. So please, I mean, unless you have some really cool data. If you have really cool data that I can't get and it's in my area of interest, which is human-computer interaction, bring me your data. I would love to just see what you're doing. But I've tried to solo author things and I've had some success, but for the most part, it's way harder. And it's sort of an echo chamber inside your head. You think what you're saying is smart because the only one you're asking about it is yourself. And you think you're smart, right? And as soon as you bring it to someone else, they'll let you know. Here's a humbling story. Some of you may know I do statistics. I do this funny thing called structural equation modeling. And I have some notoriety for that topic. People think I do it well enough that they pay me to go and do workshops on it. And I have many videos on it, hundreds of videos, and of course I've written on it. I thought, you know, I know this area well enough that I'm gonna solo author a manuscript on structural equation modeling. What's more natural? So I wrote it, thought this is pretty good. I revised and revised, and it was really solid, I thought. And so I submitted it to the Journal of Structural Equation Modeling, and it got desk rejected. And I was like, wait, what? And the editor said, you clearly don't know anything about structural equation modeling. I was like, oh no, I'm a fraud. I'm such a fraud. They were being a little hyperbolic. They were exaggerating a little bit, but what they were trying to say, and I submitted this article elsewhere because obviously they were wrong, right? I submitted it elsewhere. It got desk rejected multiple times. And so finally I revised it well enough, it got some reviews and then rejected. It's been in my lap for a couple years now. And I've come to realize that I need a co-author. Even a co-author who doesn't know structural equation modeling as well as I do. Any co-author will help round out my ideas. And so I've recently, just last week, I invited finally a co-author on this paper, and we're going to get it published. And he's going to read through it and he's going to say, this is really good, except this weird stuff, fix that. And then we'll submit it and it'll be better and it'll get published. So have co-authors. And then this is the risky one. This is the scary one. Send it to the editor-in-chief or a senior editor at the journal you want to submit it to before you submit it. So don't go through the submission system. Go find the editor you want and say, hey, I've got this idea and I think it's perfect for your journal, but I just want to make sure it's a good fit. Give me 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and just send them the abstract. Don't send them your manuscript. Send them your bullet abstract. And say, I don't want you to spend time on this. Just 2 to 3 minutes, yay or nay. Is this headed in the right direction? And they'll say no, or yes, or tell me more, which is more than you had a moment ago. And you won't waste 3 months of it in the review system just to get rejected. You'll get feedback right away that'll help put you again in the right trajectory so you land in the right spot and avoid desk reject. All right, handling rejections. We got to move faster. Let's see. Get over it. You'll get rejected. Get over it. If you need to write out a venting response that's highly emotionally charged, write it out and then throw it away. And then write a real review response. Importantly, rejection doesn't mean you're a bad researcher. Rejection doesn't mean you're a bad writer or a fraud. It just means there wasn't a good fit for your article at that journal. It might fit somewhere else. It might mean you need to improve in your researching or writing or expertise or storytelling, but it doesn't mean you're bad. It just means you need to work on it. And there is definitely some randomness and chance to the publishing process. I've submitted manuscripts that I thought were epic and amazing, and they got desk rejected. I've submitted manuscripts that I thought were just okay, and they got accepted with no revisions. And I've submitted one paper, this was fun. I submitted a paper to a conference and it got rejected. And then I submitted the same paper, no revisions, to a journal, got accepted, minor revisions. There is some randomness and chance with who reviews your paper and whether they like it and what they had to eat that day and how their relationship is going with the people in their house and whether their dog is sick. I mean, and whether their sports team is winning. So if you get rejected, just try again. Really, just try again. There is some strategy though. Let's say you get a revise and resubmit. What do? Don't worship or write worshipful language in your review response. I see this a lot from co-authors of mine. Yeah, they'll say things like, "You are the most amazing. We appreciate so much. We could never have come to this conclusion on our own. You are just this flagrant, inflammatory, flowery language that is just kind of nauseous." Maybe that's in American speaking. I don't know. You don't need to inflate my ego so big that I accept your paper. That's not going to work. Flattery doesn't work in the review process. It gets kind of annoying, actually. I just want to intellectually engage with you. And that's the point. Bottom line, reviewers want to feel like they helped contribute to your manuscript. So let them know that they did. Even if they didn't, let them know that they contributed to your manuscript. And that will help them feel better about letting your paper through the process. Don't ignore them. If they ask you to do something and you don't want to do it, explain why you don't want to do it. But don't ignore it. Don't patronize them. Again, flattery is no good. Don't mock them. There's lots of opportunity to mock reviewers. They are not experts as much as you are experts in your field. You are the expert. And they'll say stuff that is stupid. It doesn't make any sense. Don't mock them. There is a temptation. And do respond to every single point of feedback they give you. The good, the bad, the ugly, the small, the large, respond to everything. Even the obviously stupid points of feedback. Occasionally reviewers will say something stupid like, "Hey, why didn't you do XYZ?" And you did. You did XYZ on page 17 and 18. You already did it. And they asked you why you didn't do it. And you're like, well, you could say, well, we did. Read page 17 and 18, duh. But instead what you say is, thank you for that feedback. That has helped improve the manuscript. We now, this is an important word, we now, in the revised manuscript, have included this very important piece based on your feedback. You think they're going to go back and reread your old manuscript to just double check they weren't wrong? No, they're not going to do that. They're going to be very grateful that you have now included this very important piece of feedback that they gave you, even though you already had it in there. So placate them, but don't flatter them. Oh, here's a rough one. Occasionally reviewers will be wrong, just flat out wrong. They'll ask you to do something that will not improve your paper. It is okay to tell them in very tactful language, we don't believe that's going to improve our paper. We see where you're coming from, but that's not going to move our paper forward. We do not want to do that. And we'll leave it to the editor to decide if this needs to be done. But you can tell a reviewer no, in very kind and understanding and empathetic words. All right, where to send your papers? Totally depends on what you're trying to accomplish here. For most of you, you're trying to get tenure, right? That you want to get promoted and get tenure. And so where do you submit your papers? You submit the papers to the journals that your department actually counts as valuable. There's some list somewhere, someone knows about it. Hopefully you know about it. If you don't know about it, go ask your department chair. They know about it. If they don't, things need to change. You need to have direction. It can't be a shot in the dark. So go find that list and publish in those journals until you get tenure. Once you get tenure, the rules change a little bit, and it's more about impact and getting it to the right audience. But until you get tenure, you need to play the game of getting tenure, which is publishing in the journals that your department cares about. period. If your paper doesn't get accepted to the journal you wanted, just send it to another journal. Apply the feedback, obviously, make the paper better, but don't get worked up over it. Just send it to another journal. I've had papers that have gone to, let's see, I'm trying to think of my longest record of number of skips, number of hops between journals. I've probably submitted a single paper at most to 6 journals. Not simultaneously, obviously, but it's been rejected from 5 and finally made it into the 6th journal. So try again. What about special issues? Should you send papers to special issues? Yes, heck yes. Special issues are awesome because they give you a deadline. It's like a conference, but it counts for more. And often there's less competition in the special issue and more of a feeling of needing to accept a certain number, a quota of papers. And so there is often more lenience in the review process. And it's not that they'll let worse papers through, they'll just be more cooperative with you to get it done right. Instead of, we've got plenty of supply, we can reject 50% or 80% or whatever it is. They'll be more willing to work with you because they want to see the special issue succeed. Collaboration, yes, do it. I've talked about that already. You got to collaborate. It is a necessary evil and wonderful blessing. It is great and terrible. You've collaborated, you know what I'm talking about. But you need to collaborate. Occasionally, ask your department chair if you need to solo author things as well, because that might be important at your university. Some universities, you have to solo author something in order to get promoted, or you have to be the primary author on something to get promoted. So make sure you understand those rules, but definitely co-author with people. Okay, that's it. So a bit of it's a numbers game. Submit a lot. I submit a paper. If I'm publishing a paper every 3 weeks, I submit a paper on average once a week, which is insane. Do you think I do that by myself? I have an army. I have an army of co-authors who are all running projects as well. And so if you're gonna try to publish a lot, you need to submit a lot. Avoid doing bad research, we talked about. Telling the right story is that those 6 questions I brought up at the beginning, you need to tell the right story at the beginning of your paper. Otherwise, who cares about the rest of the paper? Targeting the right journal, collaborating, we talked about, and luck. Yeah, there's some luck to it. Okay, that was a lot of stuff. I have until, what, 10 after the hour? Is that right?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, we have some time. We have 25 minutes. Okay, I hope you stand up and stretch or something. Yeah, because that was a lot of like fire hose stuff. Andy sent me a list of questions that you guys asked, and I've listed some of them here. I have a slide for each one of them. I'm going to talk about them. I haven't been looking at the chat window. If you've been sending chat questions, I figured that with 200 to 300 of you, it would be a little unmanageable and with time constraints. So I'm just going to talk and hopefully cover some of your questions. Okay, in my experience, what are the most common errors in quantitative manuscripts? There are so many, so many I could cover. I've sort of boiled it down to the very, very most prominent and frequent. The first is skipping steps. People will totally skip the data screening, data preparation. They won't talk about normality assumptions, like is your data skewed or kurtote? Was there a lot of missing data? Did you have to drop items for various reasons, for like missing data or normality issues? Are your variables, do they factor together? Are they reliable? They'll skip these steps and jump straight to a causal analysis. They'll say, here's my model, I tested my model, here are the p-values and the regression weights, hypothesis proved or supported, and that's wrong. You need to do sort of the legwork up front to make sure your data is valid, and then your measures are valid, and then you can test your theories. So that's one of the biggest problems. People just skip steps. Failing to justify big decisions is another very common thing. Let's say you're talking about your factor analysis, And in your factor analysis, we notice that you dropped 7 items, 7 measures. And maybe you mentioned that. But then you just go on to the next part of the analysis and you never explain why you dropped 7 items. That's not like a small thing. That's a big deal. You need to explain that. Why did you drop them? What was the criteria you were using? Please explain that stuff. This is sort of related, cliffhangers. It's when you say there's some big problem and then you just ignore it. Like you say, we had method bias. So on to mediation testing. And you don't explain what you did because you had method bias. Like what were the decisions you had to make because you had method bias, or whatever the issue may be. We had data non-normality, or our data was not linearly related, but we're testing it with linear methods like regression. If you don't explain these big mysteries, these big potential red flags, then how can we trust your findings? So don't skip over things like that. Here's a fun one. Very often I'll get a manuscript that has very rich data, maybe multi-time longitudinal data, 5 different time points, or it'll be multi-method. They'll have collected surveys and used archival data, or something. They'll just have really great data, but they'll hardly bring it up. You should be, I hate to use the word brag. You should be bragging about your data. You should extol its virtues so that people see that you have value to add. Don't just pretend your data is an artifact of the research. You can do that if you did like an online survey of students. You can ignore that. But if you have great data from like companies, from real people, over multiple sites, multiple times, explain that. Explain how awesome that is. You don't have to say it's awesome, but don't gloss over it. It's one of your contributions. And then on the flip side of that, it's explaining the limitations of your data. If you fail to explain that your data was lousy, that's not being transparent. You need to be transparent about your data. And that is often a missed thing in quant papers. Very common, this next one, it's stating a hypothesis for one thing, but then testing another. So for example, saying that, let's see, customers who return, who are loyal to our company, are more likely to buy from our gift shop. And then you try to test that with a regression. The wording of the hypothesis needs to match the testing of the hypothesis. If you're talking about groups of people, you need to use a group testing method. If you're talking about variance in constructs, sure, do a correlation or a regression or SEM. But if you need to match the hypothesis you're stating with the way you're testing the hypothesis. Ooh, trying to use SEM for everything. This was another question I've sort of consolidated into this one, which is somebody asked, should I use SEM? Am I more likely to get published if I use SEM instead of like a t-test or a linear regression or a NOVA? And the answer is no. SEM's fancy and nice, but only for the most appropriate problems, for the problems that are appropriate to SEM, which is testing an interrelated network of effects, interdependent effects. If you're just talking about a difference in groups, do a t-test or a NOVA if you have multiple groups. If you're just talking about associations between lots of variables, do a correlation. Do what is appropriate for your hypothesis. SEM is not always the right answer, and it's often the wrong answer, depending on your data and your research questions. Ooh, and then this one. This is the big downfall. This is the one that sinks papers. It is the quote-unquote fatal flaw, and it's endogeneity, which is when you miss the opportunity to measure very important constructs. So this happened to me. It was probably 10 years ago. We submitted a paper. It was about value-based pricing and how value-based pricing affects revenue, company revenue. And the journal came back and said, that's fascinating, but we don't trust you. We do not trust your findings. because you did not account for the size of the company. And everyone knows revenue is based on number of employees. It's known in the literature. So if you don't include that, you have a huge endogeneity problem. There's some third factor that you're not accounting for that is making both of those move together. So it looks like those two things are related, but they're not. They're related to company size, number of employees. And they were right. We went back and collected data on number of employees, stuck it in our model. All of a sudden, our main hypothesis failed because we didn't account previously for the biggest confounding variable. If somebody submits a paper to a journal and I'm editing it and they're trying to predict something like customer satisfaction or job satisfaction or brand loyalty, something like this, which has so many known predictors, and they don't include the known predictors, I cannot have any confidence in their findings. And so it is a fatal flaw. They might have to go back and recollect data and toss out the data they have. So do your homework before you collect data is what I'm saying. All right. Are advanced statistical tools and analyses viewed more favorably? We talked about this. The answer is no, kind of, not really. When they're appropriate, yeah. If you're trying to do a linear regression or a correlation table or something like that on something that truly should use growth curve models or SEM or hierarchical linear modeling or something fancy, well then yeah, you're doing it wrong. And the more advanced method is looked upon more favorably when it's more appropriate. But if it's not more appropriate, no, a t-test is fine. What about covariance-based versus variance-based or components-based statistics? When should you use them? There are lots and lots of opinions about this. There have been fights, if you can call academic papers fights, about this. One of my favorite papers on this, you got to look it up. It's called Haters Gonna Hate. That's the name of the paper. It's great. It's by Stacy Petter. Haters Gonna Hate, and it's about partial least squares and how there's this war going on about whether it's a legitimate methodology. And anyway, it's great. You got to read it. The answer is, I can give you my opinion. My opinion is use the right tool for the right research question. Sometimes PLS is appropriate, or a variance-based approach, components-based approach. I use covariance-based approaches for everything, unless I have a second order or higher order of some level, formative endogenous construct, something that's being predicted that is multidimensional. That's what I'm trying to say. If I have a multidimensional thing being predicted, I use partial least squares, a variance-based approach. If I don't have that, I use a covariance-based approach because there is model fit criteria associated with covariance-based methods. And so there's a way to essentially test alternative models without having to test a bunch of alternative models. There's a way to place confidence in the way the model is configured. In PLS, there are ways to do this, but they are less accessible and less tested and rigorous, tested and vetted. That's the word I was looking for. So yeah, PLS tools are getting better, and like Smart PLS 3, they're actually coming out with 4. I was talking with Christian Ringel a couple weeks ago, and he said they're coming out with version 4. I'm so excited. I'll have to make some new videos on that. Don't tell anyone. I'm not sure if I was supposed to tell anyone. All right. And that gets me back to the tools. The covariance-based tools for like WYSIWYG, drag and drop stuff are not getting better, but the PLS tools are. So the gap is getting closer, I guess, between those two. Here's a question I get all the time. Is it compulsory to do an EFA before a CFA? The answer is no, it is not, except when you're doing a truly exploratory bit of research. If you did not have a measurement theory going into your data collection, then yeah, you need to do an EFA. Now, That's not going to apply to like 99%, 99.9% of your studies. For the most part, you collect data based on a theory of how things are measured. You say these 4 survey questions belong to this construct, and these 4 belong to this construct. And so you already know there's no exploration going on in the measurement validation. But I always do it anyway. I always do an EFA, always, 100% of the time. Why? Because the EFA is really good at identifying discriminant validity issues because it's unguided. In an EFA, you just say, here are the variables. Now let an algorithm figure out how they're related. Don't let me dictate that. Let the algorithm figure it out. In a CFA, it's guided. You say these 4 belong to that one, these 4 belong to that one, and you're telling the software how to organize and group all the measures. Well, if you do that, you miss an opportunity to see where there are big cross loadings and failed loadings and things like that. And EFA surfaces all of those issues very easily. And my philosophy as a scientist is more information is usually better information. And so why wouldn't you do an EFA? I mean, it's just more information. Is that going to hurt your study to do an EFA? Is it going to invalidate your research? No, it's only going to make it better. So do you need to report it? No. So if you do an EFA when you didn't have to do an EFA, do you have to report it? No, you can just report the CFA. Hope that answered that. Didn't muddy the waters too much. Common issues in convergent discriminant validity and how to solve them. Somebody asked about this. Yeah, one of the most common things I see is scholars will try to apply reflective validation criteria, such as the composite reliability, Cronbach's alpha, AVE. They'll try to apply that to a non-reflective set of measures, to something like an index or a score or a composite set of measures. But it's irrelevant. Those criteria, validation criteria, are only relevant to reflective sets of measures, measures that are inherently interchangeable and highly correlated. And so if you try to apply a Cronbach's alpha to a set of unrelated sets of measures, well, not unrelated, non-reflective, then you're going to end up falsely dropping items, mistakenly dropping items in order to try to meet some irrelevant criteria. So whereas you had 10 measures to begin with, you got rid of 6 of them because they wouldn't correlate highly enough. But they weren't designed to be highly correlated. And so it's applying the wrong tool to the problem. So that's one of the biggest issues. Trying to validate 2 highly correlated dimensions of the same construct usually gets us into trouble. So let's say you have some higher order construct like brand loyalty, and there are 2 dimensions of it, which I cannot think of at the moment, but they're highly correlated and you can measure them separately. So you have 2 different factors for those 2 dimensions of brand loyalty. Well, when you stick it into a factor analysis, they look to be like all squished together and load on the same factor, and they won't discriminate and become distinct. That's okay. We expect dimensions of a higher order construct to be highly correlated. That's expected. So can you relax the discriminant validity criteria a little bit? Yes, you can. You need to explain it. You need to explain why you're relaxing it. But any rational, what's the word I'm looking for? Educated scholar who's evaluating your work will say, oh, these are dimensions of the same construct. Of course, they're going to be highly correlated. That's rational. So yeah, it's okay. Over trimming happens a lot. And I'm to blame for some of this. For those who have watched my videos from like a decade ago, I was an eager young scholar, not sure of everything I was doing, and I would drop measures left and right if they didn't meet my criteria. I've learned a few things in the past decade, and you should be very cautious of dropping measures from your study. Those were designed specifically to measure the constructs that you want to use in your model. So why are you dropping them? You should only drop items if there is overwhelming evidence that retaining them undermines the measurement of the construct. If that's the case, then yeah, drop it. If it's going to make it so you can't measure the construct, drop it. But otherwise, you should keep everything you can. Hold on tight to everything you measured as best you can. Garbage in, garbage out. This is a common thing. People will design measures or adopt measures from others that don't measure the construct that they think it's measuring. And then they wonder why none of their hypotheses were supported. Well, it's because you didn't measure what you thought you measured. So design things very carefully and strategically. Get feedback on it. Do your pre-tests and pilot tests and Q sorts and stuff like that. Sample size considerations. I don't want to spend too much time here. The thing you need to remember is you need to have enough data to run the test you want to run. And if you have multiple groups in your data, then each group needs to have an adequate sample size. So if you say, oh, my G-power calculator said I needed 207 sample size. But then if you're going to split that into 3 different groups, like let's say you have 3 countries and you're going to compare the countries, well, you need 207 for each country, for each of those groups. So that's one consideration that often gets overlooked. If you have a huge sample, it's very important to include effect sizes because your p-values are always going to be statistically significant with a huge sample. So check your f-squareds. Unequal group sizes, not a big deal as long as your smallest group is sufficient. If you have group sizes that are like one is 10% of the other, like you have one group of 100, another group of 1,000, then you might do a random sampling of the larger group a few times just to test robustness and make those sizes a little bit more equal. All right, developing survey instruments. What are the best practices? I have written a wiki page on this, so go there and check out those best practices on putting together survey instruments. When adopting others, and this is the best practice typically, is you adopt somebody else's validated measures. You don't usually create your own. Very rarely is there good justification for creating your own measures. So adopt someone else's. When you do, I strongly recommend you don't just keep them verbatim, because typically they're not going to match your study verbatim. So go ahead and adapt the ones you adopted, adapt them to your context so that the wording is right and you're measuring the thing you want to measure, but make sure to keep the spirit and intent of that measure. Try not to change that. Keep its core. Oh, sweet, I got through them. Wow, just in time. Here's a shameless plug. I created an online SEM course. I used to offer a boot camp. I would fly people, well, I wouldn't fly people in, people would fly in from all around the world, and we'd do an annual boot camp on structural equation modeling. It was literally 3 semesters of SEM in 3 days. It was insane. And then COVID hit. And I was like, well, I can't do this, so let me build an online course for people to take instead. So I put everything from the boot camps into a new course, and it's not actually stuff from the boot camps. I created all new videos. It's like 40 new videos and 20 new data sets, and there are citations and exercises and projects and exams and grades if you want, although you don't have to use the grades. And it's a full course from basic stuff like assumptions and p-values and what is error, all the way up to multi-group analysis, mediation, serial mediation, moderation, things like that. So it goes from beginning to end, and there's data throughout the whole thing, and exercises and videos and stuff to walk you through everything. And there's even a forum devoted to it where you can get your questions answered. So it's fun. It's way cheaper than the boot camp. So I'm glad we did that. There it is. Shameless plug. Okay. I am ready. Look at that. I ended 2 minutes early.
Thank you, Associate Professor Dr. James Eric Gaskin, for such a great sharing. Okay, to all attendees, if you have any question related to today's webinar,
Oh, did we lose you? Did you lose me? Uh-oh. You froze. Did I freeze? No, I think it's just you. Uh-oh. Well, I assume she said ask your questions. And I think we have 20 minutes.
We lost the Dr. Wan. Do we lose her?
Yeah, it looks like we lost her, but that's all right. I can answer questions. I don't know how. Oh, she's back. Hello. Okay. So I see some questions in the chat window. I guess I'll just look over there.
Yeah.
Let's see. What kind of methods? This is from Ida Ismail. What kind of methods and data analysis techniques that high-impact journals are looking for? I was told that the journal editors won't accept t-tests in ANOVA even when the problem is significant. Good journals, journals that count, will accept whatever method is appropriate. Journals that don't know what they're doing and are just there to get your money or get impact or something like that, yeah, they'll impose silly, irrational constraints like this. But any journal that's worth its paper will just accept whatever method you use as long as the method is appropriate for the question you're asking. So no, yeah, there's no preference for fancy methods unless fancy methods are merited or appropriate. Let's see, from Christy Bitter. Thank you. My question, here we go. My data are not normally distributed, so I use non-parametric statistical tests to do the data analysis. What are the implications of using non-parametric statistical tests? Will it make my results any less valid? For instance, I've read that in social sciences it is common that data are not normally distributed due to underlying nature of constructs being measured. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, I've sort of toyed with this throughout the years. I've sort of battled with this. Statistics and statistical measures and criteria and thresholds and all that stuff, we as scholars have taken them pretty far, and we try to hold to them very rigidly. And there needs to be a lot more lenience, in my opinion, of what is quote unquote valid and normal. For example, you may be familiar with the KS test or the Shapiro-Wilks test of normality. Those are so strict. I don't know that I've ever had a variable be normally distributed using those tests. But are they sufficiently normal? Yeah. And so as long as it's normal enough, it goes back to that thing I said, if it's not undermining the measurement of the construct, then you're good. As for whether a non-parametric test will have side effects, the answer is there have been tests on this, whether a severely non-normal distribution will influence the outcomes. The answer is in non-parametric methods, less so than parametric methods, but yeah, there's still some influence, especially for extreme non-normality. So do what you can to get things back to normal. If you're using a Likert scale, like a short interval, short scale, like a 7-point scale or a 5-point scale, there's very little you can do for non-normal because you can't like transform it. There are very few data points or scale positions. If you're using continuous data, then there's a lot you can do to make that data normal. I encourage all of you to go look up, let's see, I think it's called the two-stage method of data normalization by Gary Templeton. He's from Mississippi State. Gary, I should just post it in here. Gary Templeton, he's one of my buddies. He and I did some studies on normality and their effect and its effect throughout causal models. But he came up with a method, he put it on YouTube for making any continuous data of any non-normality back to perfect normality. It's really cool. And he has a paper about it you can cite. Okay, next question from Fazla. What's the best data analysis method for RCT? What's RCT? I'm thinking remote control. I'm not in this field. It must be something like, is that like tourism is T and R is, I don't know what this is. Randomized control studies, no? Predictive, what is RCT?
Yeah, I think those who ask the question, you can speak.
I think what she meant is randomized control trial.
Oh. Oh, yeah, I thought it was something to do with tourism and hospitality or something like that. Okay. What's the best data analysis method for randomized control trial? Typically something basic like an ANOVA or a t-test. A paired samples t-test or independent samples t-test is what I've used for those kind of experimental approaches. When there's a treatment and a control or multiple groups, when we're looking at the differences in distributions, then t-test is great. It's simple, but it works. Yeah. Let's see, somebody says, can you elaborate, can a gap in research be considered as an appropriate contribution? As you said, it can be a symptom of a problem, but not the problem. Yeah, so a gap in research is important. It's necessary, but it alone cannot be your contribution. It may be a contribution, but it can't be the contribution. The contribution needs to be to the problem. And if there's a gap in the literature, filling it isn't a contribution unless filling it solves a problem. So yeah, that's what I meant. A gap's not enough unless filling the gap solves a problem, a real problem. The problem can't just be we don't understand this well enough. That's a gap. Or the problem can't be there are inconsistent findings. That's a gap. The problem needs to boil back down to people or money, pretty much, or the well-being of the planet or something like that. What's the real problem? Are people getting stressed? Or people losing money, losing jobs, relationships falling out? What's the real problem? Okay. Predictive studies, are they good to conduct? Yeah, definitely. They're hard to do really actually predictive studies. It usually requires multiple time points, usually requires a treatment or an intervention so you can rule out alternative causes. It is nigh unto impossible to do a predictive study with a survey, especially a cross-sectional survey taken at one time point. So yes, they're doable, but they're harder than just doing basic surveys. See, Dolly says, may I know your opinion on cross-sectional versus longitudinal? Oh, great. Okay. Yes. Obviously, longitudinal is more rigorous. Typically, I mean, if it's done right, it's more rigorous. The data is better. Why? Because you're able to establish an effect over time, a lingering or lasting effect. Whereas a cross-sectional survey, you are subject to whatever was going through that person's head at the time, right? Let's say you collect your data on the day, let's pretend it was the beginning of the pandemic, and everybody was in lockdown. You think you're going to get different data that day, asking the exact same people the exact same questions, and if you would ask them a week before lockdown? Yeah, you're going to get totally different answers. They're going to be influenced by all sorts of exogenous factors. So collecting data over time is almost always better. It's harder, more expensive, there's more attrition, you lose sample, but it's almost always better. That being said, what % of published research uses longitudinal data? Less than 10% probably. Yeah. Okay, let's see, next question. Working in teams for a manuscript project can be challenging. Yeah. Can you share some tips on how you work with collaborators effectively? Yes, it totally depends obviously on who's on your team. But there are some typical teammates, stereotypes. There's the person who's just sitting in the background pretending like they're doing something and they're not doing anything. There's the advisor who just pontificates, you know, really important ideas and expects you to go do the work. There's the person who gets it all done. That's you, right? And then there are guys who sit on a paper and sit on it and sit on it and sit on it for a month, 5 months, a year. And no matter how much you email them, they never get anything done. So how do you deal with that? I've dealt with this differently. Today, I was telling my wife earlier, I've complained so much about a particular co-author that she knows him by name, never met him, knows him by name. And I said, guess what? This co-author submitted a paper today. He submitted our paper at last. It's been like 3 years and he submitted it. And we celebrated, it was great. And we were so excited. I have emailed that co-author. At first it was every week, and then every month, and then every couple months. I've never stopped emailing him until it got submitted. And he appreciated the emailing, or he said he did, but it got done. I've had others. I have a paper right now with a prominent scholar. He has been sitting on this paper for, no joke, 7 years. No matter how much I've emailed him, he won't return it. He returns my emails, just not the paper. He's like, oh yeah, I need to get to that. Never does. In that case, I've given up on that one. I do not expect it ever to be published. Yeah. And if you can, meet in person. That, not right now. I mean, obviously during a pandemic, watch yourself. But when things are safe to meet in person, when you can, meet in person, because things get done. There's accountability in face-to-face meetings. All right, I know we're running out of time here. Oh, it's 8:20 already, my time. I probably need to stop here, yes?
We still have like 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yeah, for Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, great, okay, cool. I will check the next question. Let's see, from Ahmed. Can we test hypotheses if our sample is not randomly selected? Also, if some of it is randomly selected, did not want to fill response to survey, can we say sample is random? Oh, wow. So randomness is, it is a difficult pursuit. Very little is truly random in research, very, very little, especially in social sciences. If you're randomly selecting customers or patrons at a hotel or a museum or whatever, it is not random. Your selection is random, but the response isn't, right? They may ignore you. And so those who respond to you, it's not, there's a system to it. It's not random. And so in studies of human subjects, getting true randomness is almost never achieved. And so what do? There are a few things you can do. You can get a larger sample size, because more sample means more percent of the population you're sampling, which means you're getting more of the randomness of exogenous effects and confounds sort of filtered out and spread out over your sample size. That's a good way to compensate for non-randomness. Another way is theoretical distributing, theoretical allocation, theoretically determined allocation to groups. So for example, let's say you have 4 different groups, you have a bunch of different people who are coming into your study. You can randomly assign them to groups, and then it is random because they're in randomly assigned groups, or you can theoretically assign them to groups, which allows for what we call subgroup representation, where any possible subgroups where the subgroup could theoretically confound the outcome is distributed across groups. For example, I did a study on the effects of team video game playing on team performance. And we had people coming in, not at random, but for one of the studies, we had multiple studies. For one of the studies, we assigned them at random. Turns out that didn't work very well because we didn't have enough sample size to random out some of the effects. So the next time we ran the study, we asked them for theoretical confounds. Have you played video games before? Do you like video games? Do you know anyone in your group? And then if we reassigned, we reallocated based on those theoretical drivers. So sometimes random is not the best. Sometimes theoretical allocation is even better. Okay, let's see. Next question from Mohammed. most editors are very particular on the issue of common method bias. Yeah. In single source cross-sectional studies, despite procedural remedies like Podsakoff, among the common statistical remedy, Harmon's one factor is no longer accepted. Some say that using a marker variable can help address CMV. What are my thoughts on CMV? All right, common method bias is definitely an issue that has had its round in the various journals, and there's a lot of battle back and forth on what is appropriate, what are the effects, how can we even attend to it or mitigate it. Most methods identify it but don't mitigate it. There are ways to mitigate it, but they corrupt your measurement. What you do in a method bias test, like when you're using a common latent factor, an unmeasured latent factor that is attached to all measured items, is you're not extracting method variance. You're extracting all shared variance. And that might be trait variance, like the trait of the construct. And so by including an unmeasured latent factor, you may be corrupting the measurement of your constructs. So how do you avoid that? Because you should be addressing method bias. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but you shouldn't let method bias testing corrupt your measures. So the way you attend to that or prevent that is in your factor analysis, include not only the factors of interest, include all latent factors in your factor analysis, even if you're not including them in your causal model. You want to include as many measures as possible because any method variance will be part of all of the measures. And so by trying to capture the common variance, the shared variance among all measures, you're going to reduce the likelihood of extracting trait variance from a limited set of measures. I don't know, I need to draw to make this make sense. If you only have a few factors in your model with a few measures, the likelihood that they have shared variance is very high. Whereas as you add more and more and more measures, the likelihood that you have a lot of shared variance gets lower and lower and lower. And so we're now sort of holding back our trait shared variance so that it doesn't get extracted by the common latent factor. So include more measures is what I'm saying when you do your method bias tests. And in as much as you can, use a theoretically derived bias variable, such as social desirability, which captures the potential method bias. Yeah. Sorry, without pictures, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I hope you were able to follow that. Let's see, from Noor. Can we conduct analysis on multi-level data using SPSS? Ooh, can you suggest software that is related? Yeah, you can use SPSS for multi-level data, depending on how your data is organized and what measures, how the measures measure the constructs. There are, I don't know how to answer this in 30 seconds or less. There are good videos on it. None of mine, actually. I've never made a multi-level video. I should do that. But there are good videos on YouTube for how to do multi-level analysis in SPSS. You can do it in any statistics software pretty much, just depending on how your data is structured and how you're measuring what you're measuring, and what your question is that you need to test. So if you're using latent factors, no, SPSS is terrible for latent factors. If you're using composites or scores or summative scores or something like that, SPSS is great. You can use it for all sorts of things. Yeah. So that wasn't a great answer. So YouTube it, that's my answer, I guess. Okay, from Juan Soraya. I've read somewhere that purposive judgmental sampling is prone to qualitative instead of quantitative. Yeah, what actually the criteria to say that purposive can also fit in quantitative? So we talked about theoretical sampling, purposive sampling, and you do that to get variance on the dependent variable. So you want to have a sample that has variance, right? Let's say you're doing job satisfaction. You don't want to just sample your happy employees. You're going to sample your mad employees as well. And so you want to get a roughly equal distribution across possible subsamples. That's purposive sampling. And yeah, that is very appropriate in quantitative. The reason it's done less is because typically in quantitative, you're throwing out a much larger net to capture your data. And so you're less, it's less precise in who you get. Whereas qualitative, there's typically fewer data points in terms of units of analysis. And so it's much easier to say, I want to interview you, I want to interview you, and you need to be this kind of employee, you need to be that kind of employee. So it is used, it's just used less. Next, your thoughts on which is better, 5-point or 7-point or 10-point Likert scale? I'm glad you asked. There's been research on this. I can't remember the name of the paper. There is research on this, whether it matters. The answer is it doesn't matter if it's between 5, 7, and 10. If you get less than 5, so 4 or fewer points, it matters because there's not enough potential variance. You end up getting some method bias due to, or measurement bias, because somebody might say, oh, I'm not a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4. I'm really like a 3.5, and they have to pick one. And so you get measurement error there. If you get more than a 10-point scale, it's been shown that those are also less good because people typically don't know that granular of measurement for themselves. So somewhere between 5 and 10 is great. I always use 5, always, 100% of the time. But that's just me. Next, and oh, we're out of time. Oh, so many good questions.
Doctor, is it okay with you? The producer would like to add in another 10 minutes since we have a lot of questions coming in.
Only if that's going to work for Noel. I don't want to eat into Noel's time.
No, don't worry.
Okay, I'll answer these questions. Okay. Let's see, do we include our supervisors' names as co-authors when they have retired? Good question. I like that one. Co-authorship is a tricky thing. I have included people on papers when they have done very little, because it's like, there's no skin off my nose. That's sorry, American idiom. It's no big deal. It doesn't hurt me to include them on this paper, and it would end up in an awkward conversation if I had to exclude them. So I've included people that didn't deserve to be co-authors. I've very rarely excluded people who contributed but didn't really contribute. In the case of an advisor, you can be more lenient because even if it's your work, it's probably their ideas. So most likely you need to include them as a co-author. I mean, I'm not just saying that because now I'm on the advisor's side of the table. It's probably best. They should do some work. But even if their work was contributing the ideas and making sure you didn't do anything stupid, that's good contribution. Yeah. And it doesn't hurt you to have their name. In fact, it helps quite often if your advisor, particularly if your advisor is well-known. The review process for the most part is double blind, right? In most journals, some journals it's not blind at all, but some journals, most journals it's double blind. We don't know who the authors are. The authors don't know who the reviewers are, but the editor does. And the editor makes the first decision. And if the editor sees Dr. whoever, super famous, super prestigious, super well-published advisor on your paper, they're not going to say, oh, reject. Even if it's a bad paper, they're going to look at it and be like, I must be missing something. There's got to be something here that is worth saving because Dr. So-and-so was on this paper. There's no way Dr. So-and-so would put her name on this paper if it were a bad paper, right? So it may even help to include your advisor. Okay. Let's see. What is the best sampling technique to generalize the findings? We talked about the two, random or purposive or theoretical sampling, and both are good. Random's good when you can get enough data. When you can't get enough data, purposive is better because then you ensure representation of subgroups, and that helps you avoid potential confounds. Okay, why our data for all the constructs are normally distributed based on the skewness and kurtosis when multivariate normality of the data is not normal? Oh, good question. Yeah, so it's a totally different test. univariate normality versus multivariate normality. So univariate, like, it's just for one variable at a time. Multivariate is the relationship between variables. So even if two variables are perfectly normal, if the tendency of the relationship is positive, but there are a few people who show a negative relationship on those variables, they will be outliers. If there are enough of those, it's a non-normal multivariate relationship. And that's perfectly normal. I'm going to admit one of my limitations in my analyses. I almost never test for multivariate normality. Almost never. Why? Because our cases, units of analysis, our cases in our data that do not conform to our theory, are they outliers? Yeah, maybe. Are they influential? Yeah, maybe. Are they wrong? No. Unless they were like unengaged and give you bad data. It's still representative of your population, and so you can't exclude them. You can report your normality and say, hey, we had non-normality, but we kept them anyway because we didn't want to have self-fulfilling prophecy in our theory, which is to only include those who confirm our theory. So, yeah. All right. From Nana. I have sent my manuscript to one high-impact journal, and unfortunately, it is rejected. Congratulations! That's awesome. Welcome to the club. I've had a couple rejections this week. All right. But a few days later, the publisher sent me an email to submit my manuscript to the other journal. They suggest 2 journals. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, so I've actually seen this before. It's happened with me a few times where I submit a paper to a journal, they reject it, and then they email me. And it's the editor usually. The editor says, saw your paper, didn't fit the journal you submitted it to, but here are some other journals you might consider. I mean, it might even be a journal that they're an associate editor on or a senior editor on. That's perfectly valid. I would strongly recommend you look into it. They probably know better than you do in that case. Okay. Can you explain a bit more on predictive studies? Yeah, so predictive studies is when you're trying to show that a cause leads to an effect. That's very hard in a survey because you can't rule out you can't establish temporal precedence that the cause came before the effect. So to do a predictive study, you need to have time separation where you apply some treatment and then test the effect of that treatment. That's how you do predictive studies. Now there are algorithms like PLS predict and predictive performance mapping and things like that. Those are different. That is, the term predict there is not implying any sort of cause and effect relationship or temporal precedence. It's implying explanation of variance. And so those algorithms are showing you how important is a certain predictor, a variable predicting, I'm using the wrong word here, a variable with a regression on another variable. How important is that variable in explaining the variance in the outcome? That is how they use the word predict in those algorithms. Okay, I know we're running out of time here. Again and again. Let's see. IPMA. Nope, I skipped one. Oh, I got lost. There it is. Okay, sorry, I found it. From Alex, is there a maximum number of measurements to use so that you don't use too many measurements? Joseph Hare, you may have read his book, Multivariate Data Analysis. He's written a bunch of stuff. He's probably the most cited methodologist in the social sciences. He wrote that the optimal number of measures for a reflective construct is 4. Any less than that, and you have inconsistency. Any more than that, and you have redundancy. He said 4 is best. So yeah, 4. I like it when there's an easy answer. Let's see, from Irene. Is assessment of IPMA relevant with social sciences? Yeah, importance performance mapping. Yeah, you can definitely use it. You'll see it in several journal articles. Let's see, from Ikmal. In Likert scale 3, 5, or 7, do we modify or to dichotomous response when measure relationships to demographic data? I think I understand what you're saying here. Let's say we have something like education level as a variable, and it has an unequal interval scale where it's some primary school or some secondary school or some college institute or some or a degree or a PhD, something like that. These are very different intervals. Can you include it as a variable? Yes, but the interpretation has to be very loose at that point, where a positive means there's a positive relationship, a negative means a negative relationship. You're not actually looking at the regression coefficient and trying to interpret that, just its direction. The better approach is to split it up into dummy binary variables and look at the effect of each level. That would be the more accurate approach. Okay, it looks like we're going to get on to the last one here. Will it be possible to use different points, 5 and 7, in the same questionnaire? You can, but you shouldn't. Pick a scale. For the sake of your respondents, pick a scale. It'll make it easier for them. While I'm on that, nobody asks this, but I'm going to answer it anyway. There is a tendency to put strongly agree as 1 and strongly disagree as 5. That is wrong. That is wrong, because you want an increase in the numeric value to be associated with an increase in the trait value. So if you're assessing customer loyalty and strongly disagree is 5, and you have an increase in customer loyalty, that's backwards, because an increase means closer to 5, which is strongly disagree. That's backwards. Always go left to right, negative to positive, less to more. And your progressions will work out, hopefully. All right, there was only one other question. I won't answer anymore. Here it is. If we collect the fieldwork data using instruments, should we validate the data with an expert? You are the expert, I hope. All of you should be becoming experts in data analysis. I've made a bunch of videos and courses in the wiki, so you can do that. I did that when I was in your place as a doctoral student, because I didn't want anyone else to suffer the way I suffered learning it. You shouldn't have to suffer through it as well. So I've made it so that you can learn it without too much effort. And so I hope you'll just figure it out and be the expert yourself. All right, that's all the questions.
Thank you again, Associate Professor Dr. James Eric Gaskin, for a very interesting topic and fresh perspective, especially on the publication, which I believe the tips shared today are beneficial, especially for novice researchers. Ladies and gentlemen, you can subscribe the YouTube channel under James Gaskin. I believe there are a lot of information related to the quantitative research and the analysis in this channel.
There are hundreds of videos.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much, Dr. Gaskin.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I really learned a lot from this. I really learned a lot. Thank you.
Good, good. Thank you.
We will take a short break and we'll be back in 10 minutes for second series with Professor Dr. Noel Scott. Thank you. For the second part of this webinar, we are very fortunate to have Professor Dr. Noah Scott, our invited speaker from University of the Sunshine Coast, Australia, with us today. Professor Dr. Noah Scott is the Adjunct Professor of Tourism Management in the Sustainable Research Centre, University of Sunshine Coast, Queensland, Australia. His research interests include the study of tourism experiences and destination management and marketing. He is also a frequent speaker at international academic and industry conferences. He has over 300 academic articles published, including 17 books. He is on the editorial board of 10 journals, a member of the International Association of China Tourism Scholars, and a fellow of the Council of Australasian Tourism and Hospitality Education. Currently, his work has yielded almost 10,000 citations with 45 high index. Please welcome Professor Dr. Noah Scott to deliver his talk on writing a review article, systematic literature review versus scoping review.
Hello there. Can you hear me? Is everything good?
Yes, yes.
Look, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. I'm going to talk about a topic which I think is very important. These are, however, my own ideas, and different types of academics have different views on these things. So very happy to take any questions as we go through. But again, thank you very much for the university to allow me to talk today. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen. Let me see, tell me if, can you see my presentation? Great, so writing a literature review. Okay, so thank you. The things I want to talk about today begin with, I think, the fundamental point. What are we doing as academics? Why are we hurting ourselves? Why are we engaging in all this reading of literature, writing of literature reviews, conducting research, and so on? And that's an interesting question. Then I want to talk briefly about what is theory, what is a literature review, how to do a literature review, and writing a review. Okay, so can I ask, I don't know if anyone wants to answer this question. Perhaps it will be rhetorical, but if anyone is interested, please let me know. What is the difference between an academic and a consultant? Interesting thing to think about. And also, what makes an excellent academic? And importantly, how do you know you are a good academic? Well, thank you. One who introduced me said that I had 10,000 well, actually 9,956 citations in Google. Does that make me a good academic? There's a big debate about that. And of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a good academic, but it does mean something. It means that people have read my work, good or bad. People have perhaps cited my papers and so on. That's not to say that people who haven't been cited aren't good. But it does mean that I've been perhaps doing research for some time, because it takes a long time to develop your citations and your H-index. All right, so does anyone have the answer? Who's got the answer to the question, what is the difference between an academic and a consultant? Anyone? If I can't get an answer, I'll have to pick someone. I'll pick, anyone wants to answer? Juan, how about you? You're there. Any ideas?
I believe there are some differences when it comes to research between consultant versus academic. Sometimes for academic, because we are maybe focusing more on the theory part, but on not so much on the practical part. But the consultant, I don't know, maybe they are more on the practical part.
That's a good answer, Juan. Thank you. And so I agree with much of what you said. A consultant wants to answer a specific problem, usually a fairly practical problem, which is a good thing to do. When they answer that problem, they will often draw upon things that they have been taught or learned at school and learnt from universities, and they will draw upon that knowledge, answer a question, but perhaps the answer doesn't go back to the literature. They're not making a contribution back to knowledge. An academic is a person who I think is adding to the combined knowledge in the field of tourism. And of course, you can do that in many different ways. I think an excellent academic is making very significant contributions to knowledge, and not all contributions are recognized, but as an academic, you perhaps might know that you are a good academic if you think you yourself are making good contributions. And for those people who are looking for promotion to a professor is usually defined as a person, an academic, who is internationally recognized as an expert in a very specific field and who has made a contribution to that field. Okay, so you, as an academic, you develop through a series of perhaps stages which lead you to being able to make a contribution in a specific field. And of course, this is where the literature review is so important, because a literature review enables you to say, I know my field. If you're going to be an expert in networks and tourism, then it's useful to be able to demonstrate that knowledge. And therefore, you might perhaps expect to write a literature review on that field in a good journal, which demonstrates that you are able to, that demonstrates that you know what you're talking about, and also that the reviewers of your literature review, consider that you know what you're talking about. So a literature review is one use of a literature review is a way to establish your understanding and get other people to recognize that you have an understanding of a very particular field in which you're studying. So obviously it's very difficult to make a contribution in a literature review to all knowledge, but it is possible to make a literature review which summarizes and then synthesizes and then makes a contribution to new knowledge in your specific field of study. Okay, so that's very important for an academic. Okay, so and then one, you were very good enough to mention theory, so thank you. What is theory? Because a literature review, well, there's different types, but the ones that I mostly look at are reviews of the academic literature on a particular theoretical field. And of course that's, but any type of literature review is difficult because it's somehow talking about some sort of field or topic in the real world. I distinguish the real world from the conceptual world that academics often deal with. Real world is practical, but academics conceptualize that world and turn it into theory. But of course, when you try and do that, you have problems because the real world is really messy. And people try and study the real world and its problems and conceptualize it in many different ways. So in this diagram, the field or the topic, the real world topic is the elephant. And this is the story of the different people, the blind men, who are all finding different aspects of the topic or the phenomena and thinking they understand it. But of course, their understandings are all different. So there are many disciplines that can be used to study tourism. So this is a diagram I've adapted from a very useful paper by John Tribe, which talks about, which shows, so in the center, we have some tourism phenomena. And each of those, that phenomena may have different parts. Maybe we're talking about marketing, or maybe we're talking about rural tourism or natural tourism or the geography or borders or host-guest relationships or motivation. Each of those different areas has its own concepts and theories which come from the disciplines. Now, we can talk about whether they're disciplines, but let's assume that sociology is a discipline. And so that when sociologists study tourism, they use concepts like the gaze, for example, or the staging of experiences, for example. And those concepts might be very different to how a marketing person might look at the same phenomena. They might look at, marketing might look at co-creation of a topic, and so on and so on. So there's many, so the first thing I would suggest you do, and this is controversial, when you're doing a literature review, be aware that different authors view the same field or phenomena that you're talking about from different disciplinary perspectives, and they don't always fit together. So when I do a literature review, when I'm reading about a particular topic, one of the first things I try and think about is, well, where are these people, where are these authors coming from? Is this a critical studies perspective? Is this a marketing consumer behavior perspective? And that helps me to sort out different ideas, because all of those people use often the same words, but in different ways. So be aware that if you're reviewing theory, you need to understand disciplinary perspectives. And so what is a discipline? And this is important because it means that because people in different disciplines think about theory and think about the phenomena in different ways. Critical studies people, God bless them, they are, are you a critical studies, but what's your discipline? Can you help me, Juan?
Critical study such as? I'm not very familiar.
Well, good. What's your discipline? What if you said you were studying a phenomenon? What would it be?
My discipline. My discipline will definitely be food marketing. I do a lot of study on that area.
Okay, Juan, I would call that a topic area. Okay. And if you use theory to study that, okay, how would you study food marketing?
Food marketing, most of the time, most of my research actually looking at the behavior, the consumer behavior.
Yeah, so I would call you a consumer behavior person, which is very good. And consumer behavior, the theories of consumer behavior usually come from either sociology or psychology.
Yeah.
Okay, and so when you're thinking about literature review in the area of food marketing or something, you might be trying to separate out. I'm sorry to do this to you, Juan. I'm picking on you, but it can be
okay.
useful. Yeah. Separate out the sociological perspectives from the psychology perspectives. Okay, in tourism, sometimes we don't do that. So, in the area of food marketing, there are at least two different disciplines being used: psychology, consumer behavior, and sociology. And those people think about things differently. A sociologist usually thinks about groups of people. They're about society or about groups, cultures. A psychologist may be thinking about groups, or they may be thinking about individual people. And so the same theory, the same theory that applies to sociology may not be useful if you're looking at individual behavior. Interesting. So each of the different disciplines has different conceptual backgrounds and assumptions and paradigms in which they work. And those things are not always easily combined. So it is important to match when you're picking a particular field of study or a particular topic, to think about which disciplines could be used and in fact which one you're going to be using. So let's think about the topic of tourism destination management. There are many different ways or disciplines, there are a few disciplines that are used typically to study tourism destination management. The management discipline, marketing, psychology, probably sociology, maybe even geography, which are all good. But which one are you focusing on? What particular type of discipline is most useful in studying the particular phenomena that you're studying within the area of tourism destination management. So this is why typically in a research study, you narrow down from broad theories or broad topics like tourism destination management to narrower topics. For example, governance of tourism destination management organizations. That would be a narrower topic which might suit theories and ideas that come from management. So management studies things like leadership, stakeholder, trust, collaboration. So if you were studying governance of tourism destinations, you might want to focus on the discipline, the management discipline, and study leadership or stakeholders. But sometimes you want to also narrow down further. And so you might look at a particular area, let's say the leadership of tourism management organizations. That's a narrower question. And then you might think about the parts of the leadership theory. So you might be looking at different definitions, different styles of leadership. People talk about leadership effectiveness. And that might lead you, in a thesis, for example, to a focus on, well, what is the relationship between leadership and tourism destination organization efficiency? That would be a very specific research question that looks at leadership within the management discipline. So this sort of analysis is very useful when you're doing a literature review to understand what particular papers or journal articles are about. You might analyze a particular paper by saying, oh, okay, this is a paper about tourism destination management. I'm reviewing tourism destination management. There are 3 or 4 different disciplines that have been used in tourism destination management. One of the subtopics that people talk about in tourism destination management is governance. That is a management concept. And one of the sub areas that people look at in tourism destination management is leadership. And this particular paper is looking at 2 sub concepts. They're looking at the relationship between leadership and organizational efficiency. Very good. So now you've looked at and analyzed where a particular paper might fit within a very broad topic area in terms of its theory, concepts that it's using, and also the particular relationships between concepts that it's studying. Does that make sense? Yes. Of course it does, because I'm a very good lecturer. Anyway, but that's tricky. That takes some practice. And as I said, any particular topic that you're reviewing, let's say you're doing a review of urban tourism research, that's a big area. You might find that people have talked about urban tourism in terms of transport and infrastructure, marketing and place in industry, management, culture, impact, sustainability, visitor perception, urban regeneration models. So if you're trying to do a review of this area, as Ashworth and Page did in this paper, Urban Tourism Research, Recent Progress and Current Paradoxes, they identified that there were many different theories and disciplines and topic areas being used. So, to recap, when you're doing a research literature review, you're examining and trying to make sense of this prior literature, the mess, all the papers that have been written on a particular topic or area. And that's hard. That's a really complicated task, because it takes you a long time to work out how all these different papers fit together. And once you do that, then you can then usually start a research cycle. So you analyze the prior literature, usually to try and identify some question or some research gap that you can do in a particular study. So a research, what a literature review does is it will identify, analyze, and synthesize the prior literature so that the next people can come along and perhaps use your literature to define new areas to work in. And this is the way academic works, the field, any academic works. They don't think about study objectives. I think I'll do a study of something. That's wrong. A good academic will begin by learning and understanding the prior literature. And if I have one complaint generally about tourism, is that it's very clear to me when people write papers, many times they do not have a clear understanding and an in-depth understanding of the prior literature. So the literature review is a central part of doing research and a central part of being an academic, which is why it's so important and why learning how to do it properly is so important. Because when you just start reading any theoretical area, let's say you're interested in psychology and you're trying to understand how different people have talked about theories and have used them in the study of tourism, it's a mess. People talk about behaviorism. One, you said that you were at tourism and that you studied using behavior, consumer behavior. Very good. But that's different to people who might study psychology from other areas. I use cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology says behaviorism was wrong because it doesn't allow you to understand what's going on in your head. Cognitive psychology, but the two are quite different. And what about people who study social constructivism? They are not behaviorists. They study how social psychology might be applied. Cognitism down the bottom, there's all sorts of different theories, even within psychology. And if you're trying to understand how the tourism people have used psychology, you need to somehow understand this mess of prior theories in psychology itself. How do you do that? Well, it's hard. It can be useful to read even a book that talks about the different theories of psychology and then try and match the ones that are being used in tourism against those disciplines or theories. So What is a theory? This is different people might agree or disagree with me, but a theory involves concepts. So everything we do as an academic probably will involve some sort of concept. We might use the concept of motivation. What's motivation? Well, it's got a definition. We might know what motivation works or what motivation is in real life. It's the things that push me to do things. But the definition of motivations, there are many different definitions. But one idea might be motivation. The other idea might be behavior. And so there's some theories in consumer behavior that said our behavior is caused by our motivation. Some people disagree. Some people talk about habit and the idea that we do things. Some people talk about instinct. So a theory has different concepts, and there's usually a relationship between them. For example, there's a concept called trust. Ooh, what's that? Well, we might sort of know from our real world experience what trust is. There's some specific definitions of it. And we might also know that a company has sales, that is, it sells things. And we might say the more a person trusts a company, the greater the sales they have. Okay, well, that's a sort of theory. And it says that as trust increases, sales increase. Of course, we would have to define exactly who is trusting and so on, but we could analyze some situations using this theory. And so theory allows us to better understand the world around us. I think it's wonderful. You know, I was often working as a consultant before I became an academic. I'd be trying to think of how to solve a particular problem. And then I realized academics have already solved that problem. I don't need to solve it myself because there's all these theories of people who have looked at that problem before and tried to understand it and come up with some generalizations, definitions and concepts and relationships that I don't have to think about. I just have to read what they say and perhaps apply it. So the value of theory is that it's like having a book which tells you how the world works. It's wonderful. And theory is developed over time from observations about the world, some inductive ideas, perhaps this part of the world is related to that bit, some theories, deduction, which is testing theories, and then experimentation. And if you can find some theories which have already been through that process, you can look further. You can have better understandings of a situation. They say you are standing on the shoulders of giants. Okay, you don't have to do all the work that people have done over hundreds of years. You can read about it and get insights that you have never thought about. So theory is important. Now, so let's now think about where the theories that we use in tourism come from. Ooh, never thought about that before. They're just there. But in my thesis, when I did my PhD some years ago, I was interested in Butler's life cycle model. You probably know about Butler's life cycle model. It's an interesting idea in the tourism literature about how destinations change over time. And I became interested in where the theoretical basis for that model. Where did Butler's ideas come from? Because he didn't come across that ideas by himself. He was building his ideas on things that he had read about. Everyone does. And there were some clues in his paper. In his journal article, he wrote about how he was talking, he was inspired by looking at a herd of deer, right? And how a herd of deer goes through specific stages, and therefore, perhaps by analogy, a destination might go through a series of stages. Very interesting. And so I started thinking, but he also used an interesting term. He used the term evolution. Oh, so he's saying that a herd of deer evolves, changes over time, like a destination evolves. So, and when you go back and try and understand where those ideas come from, they come from biology. So life cycle theory in the tourism or the social sciences and then in the tourism literature comes from ideas from biology from about the 1800s. Then later on, another biological theory came along called natural selection. It was Darwin's theory of evolution. And those ideas then were transferred to the social sciences, and they thought about perhaps that societies evolve. And then, of course, there were lots of other types of evolutionary theories that were thought up in biology: sociobiology, gene culture, coevolution, punctuated evolution, niche creation. And they superseded the ideas, the earlier ideas in biology. So no one in biology now talks about stages theory. But in tourism, in the 1980s, they still do. And that's where Butler's life cycle model came from. He was using, by analogy, a theory or an idea that originally came from biology, was imported into the social sciences and applied to study destinations. Interesting. Is that good? Well, yes and no. As long as it's just a metaphor, or as it's just like a little telling a story, that's useful. But if you start to believe that stages theory is a theory which predicts how a destination might work, you have problems. And that's where Butler's life cycle model sort of went wrong. Anyway, that was my thesis. I spent a lot of time thinking about that. But what I want to do is now, you see, it's the general process. The general process of theories in tourism, they come from outside tourism. This may shock people, but I don't believe tourism has theory. Tourism is an application area where theories from other areas such as psychology, sociology, and so on are applied. That's why they call it an applied field. So every case, when we're using a theory in tourism, it comes from outside tourism. So if we're studying, as one is, consumer behavior, then she will be using psychological theories. And the question is, Which one? Because there are many. And the predominant or most useful, arguably, theories in psychology change. And in psychology, the history of psychology can be thought of as Freud and people who are studying cognitive thinking, but using all sorts of strange ideas. Then people who thought that that was wrong, that you can't understand what's happening in our brain, and therefore they became behaviorists. They became people who said, we don't know how the brain works, so we will correlate stimuli and response. That's behaviorism. Good. Most recently, there are other and new theories that have come from the psychology and all the work that they have been doing, which says maybe we're starting to understand how our brain actually works. We don't need behaviorism anymore. We can start to use other theories. So that's what's happened in psychology. Cognitism was reinvented in about 1980s in psychology, but in consumer behavior, the majority of researchers still use behaviorism. And of course, in tourism, sport, and hospitality, we tend to use behaviorism. That's all fine. There's no problem with any of that. It's just that you've got to understand how your discipline and the theories that you're using in tourism are related. And that's one of the reasons why one might do a literature review. So what is a literature review? How am I going for time? One, I've been talking for about, how long? 45 minutes, is it? Anyway, yeah. So I talk a lot. I'm not sure if I'll be able to get through my whole slides, but I'll get there. Okay, so what is a literature review? Well, a literature review is collecting published material and analyzing it and synthesizing it, right? So it can cover a long, usually you might start a literature by thinking about a particular topic, tourism impacts, or you might think about studying a particular theory, cognitive psychology. Whatever you're doing, you're trying to establish and collect the relevant papers about that topic, get them together, analyze them, and try and make some new synthesis which helps you to understand and helps other people to understand something about that topic that they didn't already know. I'll come back to that. So a review should be critical. One of the biggest problems is that in systematic reviews, people are descriptive. There are many literature reviews that I find in the tourism literature which say the main authors in this area are X, Y, and Z. The topics, the methods that have been used to study this area are X, Y, and Z. The theories that have been used are X, Y, and Z, and that's about it. They don't. That's description. That's what I might think about it, that an undergraduate might do. An academic paper is not just description. It's analysis and synthesis, and we'll come to that. So one of the big problems in systematic literature reviews that I read about in many areas of the tourism journals is that they are description and not critical synthetic analysis. So what I mean is you can find the answer, you can understand what the paper, the results of the paper are by counting. How many papers did this author write? How many papers did that author write? Make a list. That's the systematic literature review. It's not sufficient. So as I say, it's about selecting, analysing and synthesising prior literature and providing a contribution. Understanding what a contribution is very tricky. I mean, that's what you do. That's the criteria for a PhD thesis. A PhD thesis is providing a contribution to knowledge. But I'm not sure if every PhD student really understands what their contribution is, or if they have made a contribution, because those PhD students, when they are then writing academic papers, write academic papers which do not, in my opinion, provide a contribution. Some people think that a contribution is a restatement of existing information. That's not what it is. So what you're trying to do in my opinion, in writing a literature review, is to simplify a complex series of papers about the problem, analyze the theories and how they work, and try and come up with some very simple representation of all that information in terms of some concepts and some relationships. That would be one way of doing a literature review. It's not the only way. So, and if you could take all of those complex ideas and relationships, analyze them, and produce a diagram relating concept 1, concept 2, and concept 3 together, with concept 2 as a mediating or a moderating variable, then that would be a contribution, okay? Because you've taken something which is a mess and provided a summary, a synthesis of all that information in a very simple form, which then people can test, okay? That would be a good outcome of a literature review. Now, at this point, it's also important to realize that there are many different types of literature review. It used to be that all of the literature reviews were narrative literature reviews. What would happen is some professor who had read most papers in an area would sit down and say, okay, here's how I make sense of it. That would be a narrative review, where they tell a story about the concepts and theories and how they're related. These days, there's different types. So these days, it's more likely that you will read a systematic review. And people think that systematic reviews are really good. And they can be, because they can clearly identify all of the literature in a particular area. Okay, that's good. That's the systematic part of the systematic review. The problem is the authors often then don't review that literature to provide an analysis and synthesis. They simply describe it and say, well, so many people talked about this literature, so many people talked about that literature, and so on. And they don't produce a synthesis which clarifies something or adds new ideas or thinks about new relationships. And that's the big problem. At this point, I also have been asked to compare a systematic literature review, which is a review within a particular tightly defined definition, often using keywords and things, from a scoping review. Now, a scoping review, and again, if we go back to that paper, you'll see it down the bottom, Grant and Booth 2009, you see, this is what I do. I don't want to try and understand how a scoping review and a systematic review are different. I haven't got the time. I'll just go and find someone who's already done a review and use their ideas. So if you want to find out the difference between a scoping review and a systematic review, you can read Grant and Booth 2009, which is a paper that discusses a topology of reviews. They talk about 14 different types. Who knew? And their associated methodologies. So a scoping review, according to Grant and Booth, is a way of rapidly getting a general idea of what's talked about in an area, on a particular topic. And it might give you some idea of how many people have written about this topic, the sort of general topics they talk about, and so on. But it's not in depth. And I think it's often the beginning of a systematic review, and it certainly may not add synthesis. It's simply descriptive. So perhaps we could say that most systematic literature reviews which are posted and in tourism journals at the moment are scoping reviews rather than systematic reviews. And as such, in my opinion, they shouldn't be published because they don't produce a contribution. Okay, so like any literature review, like any paper, any good research starts with a question. And if you look at many systematic literature reviews, you'll see their questions. Their questions are, how many papers have been written in countries or universities or by different authors on topics or using different theories? How many? Because of that, I call it descriptive. You can answer that question by giving a frequency distribution. That's not you could argue that it's it's grouping knowledge together, but in my opinion, that's not sufficient synthesis. The other thing, the other question that systematic literature reviews often say is that their aim or the question is to identify research gaps. Well, that's interesting, but in my opinion, that's the reviewers' ideas themselves. It's very difficult to justify a gap, which is by definition research which is not yet available, on the basis of a review of the literature which is available. Now, you can do it, but one way to do it that I've found useful is to say, well, in the psychology literature, they talk about introspectionism, behaviorism, and cognitive psychology. If we review the tourism literature, we find papers that are introspectionist, behaviorist, but no or very few papers which discuss cognitive psychology. Therefore, there is a research gap. But I identified that research gap not on myself, but by comparing to the original discipline. You're reviewing the papers within tourism without having some comparison on which to compare the papers with that other source is not a good way of identifying research gaps. It tends to be just the author's opinion. Okay, so a good question might be, develop a framework that multiple stakeholders can use as a reference to understand the contours of food waste in food services establishments in educational institutions. Is it a good question? Well, I think it's moving in the right direction, because the aim is to develop a framework. By definition, well, by general usage, a framework is a series of concepts, or it's some way of summarizing and synthesizing the literature into a more tightly defined form. Another interesting fact that I think is very useful to think about is that if you see, a literature reviews doesn't review often individual papers. It reviews the literature as a whole. It doesn't say paper A said this, paper B said this, and paper C said this. It says, it talks about that A, B, and C have all studied this topic, but they have examined it from different perspectives. That's the difference between describing something, essentially an annotated bibliography, and providing some analysis that compares the various papers together. Okay? And so you take 3 papers, not just one at a time, but 3 papers or 10 papers, which seemingly are similar in some way, and you compare and contrast them to see some pattern. That would be a good literature review. Well, it's a good part of a literature review. So this is something I came across once, the idea of the paradigm funnel, which is a way of thinking about all papers in a particular area, because it says most papers in a particular topic are going to be empirical generalized observations. Someone comes along and studies something and writes some results. Some people actually develop analytical methods to study that, which are different from the normal ones. Some people actually start to think about specific theories and how this topic may be studied using theories which are different from what is normal. And only very few papers will talk about core assumptions and question the core assumptions of a disciplinary area or of a field. And so, as an example, most consumer behavior people think that the core assumption is that we cannot understand what's going in a person's head. That's a core assumption. There are some papers in psychology, and now a few in tourism, which question that core assumption. They make different assumptions. Okay, so if you were conceptualizing or analyzing all consumer behavior literature in tourism, you might be saying the majority of papers use a behavioral approach, which is true. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just describing it. And the specific theories that they use are basically those that are derived from behavioral psychology. There are a few that use different theoretical models, and you might distinguish those. Okay, so the paradigm funnel can be a useful way of, at a very top level, thinking about the theories that are used. And I've got to say, the majority, I think, of tourism literature papers are primarily empirical observations using theory from other areas. Possibly some papers have actually developed specific scales for analyzing a thing in tourism. There are some particular, the majority of theories are very much the ones from other areas. And there are very few papers, perhaps 5 in the tourism literature, that really examine the core assumptions. There's some interesting work, for example, in hospitality, where people have said, well, what is hospitality? Is it what the management people think hospitality is? Or is hospitality fundamentally different and is about a person sharing? You know? So that's a sort of paradigmatic or core assumption that might be challenged. Anyway, once you've got your papers together, you have to then start analyzing and synthesizing the literature. And how do you do that? Well, it takes time. One technique that's useful to begin is to develop a table. So this is what they call charting or tables, where you start by listing all the papers that you've got from 1 to 1,000 or 100 or 10, and then you start to say, okay, well, what's this paper about? And it might be about cognitive psychology. You say, okay, well, I'll call column 2 issue 1, and I'll say that paper is about cognitive psychology. And I'll find another paper that's also about cognitive psychology. So I'm going to put another box in there. And then I'll find 2 more papers, but I understand that they're not about cognitive psychology, they're about behavioral psychology. Therefore, I put a tick in column number 3. Then, and you can think of the headings for the various columns as anything you like. Could be paradigms, could be theories, it could be concepts, it could be relationships, it could be findings of some type, whatever, doesn't matter. And so but you do, and then you can say, then once you've done that, you can start to analyze the whole of the literature. Because if I looked at those 4 articles and those 3 issues, I would start to say, oh, okay, well, in this literature, there are 4 main articles, and those articles differ in terms of issue 1, 2, and 3. 2 articles only deal with issue 1, 2 articles only deal with issue 2, and some papers use a mixture for whatever. Oh. The point is that's a analysis and beginning of a synthesis of the whole literature. So what do you do when you're doing a literature review? You begin by reading the papers, becoming familiar with it. And then you might start to identify some themes, some issues that you're interested in, issue 1, issue 2, and issue 3. Then you might go through and say, okay, well, article 1 is about issue 1 and 3, article 2, and then you might develop some charts, and then you might start mapping and interpreting that information. That's what I would call analysis and synthesis, okay? Oh, there are other ways of reviewing the literature, such as doing bibliographic analysis, analyzing keywords, or co-citation analysis, or, sorry, I'll go back. So bibliographic analysis is useful, but it's not often providing useful analysis and synthesis of theory. Usually, sorry, going back again. Usually, for example, bibliographic keyword analysis will enable us to understand that that papers which talk about tourism, or no, let's say the papers that talk about the topic of identity will also often relate to authenticity. Useful. Well, that's interesting. But what does that mean? Why is that important? It's an empirical observation about keywords, but it's not, in my opinion, providing insight into why that happens. Why is there a relationship between identity and authenticity in some papers? Similarly, bibliographic citations is about authors. It's about who writes papers and who they write with, and perhaps which journals co-cite each other. Very interesting. That can be interesting, but what does that mean? Why is that useful as a way of synthesizing and creating new knowledge? It doesn't. It's just a description. Here's an example which is sort of moving towards, I think, providing some sort of analysis and synthesis. So this was a paper that I saw recently, International Journal of Contemporary Hospitality Management, 2021. It's a systematic literature review, and it contains on the right-hand side some counting. So it contains how many papers were published in which journal. Interesting. It contains how many papers were published in different years. Interesting. What does that mean? Well, it means there's more interest in this topic. But so what? There's more interest in every topic in tourism. It talks about the various theories that have been used in food waste. Huh? Yeah, but so what? It's counting. But they also then move to a little bit more analysis and synthesis. So they start to look at the various types of papers. You'll see there's a diagram there with thematic foci. So they say there are different themes within this literature, some about drivers of food waste, some about operational strategy for recycling and so on. And there are subheadings of that. Starting to arrange the literature in a sort of typology, well, moving towards, and probably arguably is, some sort of analysis and synthesis of the literature. But then we move down to the next one, down the bottom, which is, it's a conceptual framework. I don't think it's a particularly good conceptual framework. I'm sorry. I hope Mr. Cow P or the authors aren't listening, but I think it's moving in the direction and probably justifies being accepted as a literature review because it provides a framework which summarizes, analyzes, synthesizes a lot of the literature into one place. All right. So that's an example, perhaps. Now, here's the other problem. So if you read literature reviews, every paper, not many papers do, but every paper should identify the contributions that they make. Huh? That's what any paper should do. It should say, this paper has contributed to the literature by doing this. And if you read that as an author, as a reviewer, and it makes sense, that paper should be accepted. But in fact, in particular for this paper that I'm analyzing, they say the authors have made a novel contribution to the research on food waste by identifying theme-based gaps and suggesting potential research questions. I don't think so. I don't think that's a contribution. That's what they think needs to be done without justification. They have proposed a framework based on the open systems approach, which is good. So I think that is a contribution. Then they say, This is the first systematic literature review to review food waste in food services, da 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 da. That is not a contribution because that is what they did. Their research did that in order to produce some contribution, which is presumably the framework. So telling me what they did is not the contribution. That's like saying Einstein created a great theory of gravity by sitting at his desk. Right? It's not the sitting at his desk that's important. It's the fact that he created a contribution of gravitation. So they also say another novel contribution of this study is that the gaps that we identified in the research are theme-orientated, paving the way for encouragement. That's not a contribution. That's the fact that they said that there are some research gaps. And as I said, those research gaps are not necessarily contributions. So many systematic reviews do not make a contribution. There are many types of reviews available that you might want to look at. And if you're looking at a particular research area, it can be good to start by finding one of these reviews. Certainly, if you're doing a new review, it can be useful to find an old review and think about how things have changed. So there's reviews of psychology, marketing, political science, sociology, and empathy. But they're discipline reviews. Then there are reviews about topics, tourism and oil, innovation, film tourism, urban tourism. They're more topic-based reviews, which can be useful. Doing a literature review, well, this is hard. I'm gonna sort of finish soon so that we have some time for questions. And I have uploaded my presentation into the chat room so anyone can download it. But briefly, conducting a literature review means getting all the literature and reading the papers and understanding it in your head, and then trying to find out what it means, maybe then looking further to try and find out if you've missed some areas, and then starting to analyze it in terms of different areas, maybe the history of the topic, key works, debates, methodological assumptions, theories and concepts, findings, critiques. And that's when you start to move to synthesizing. If you're doing a literature review, don't reinvent the wheel. You can start with an encyclopedia or a book or previous review articles. You don't have to go right to reviewing journal articles first because people have already done that. What you're trying to do often is to see what people have already written in encyclopedias or books, how they have arranged the literature, and then see if something's different about it. So think smart. Write conceptual maps to try and organize all this information you've got, and then try and create this synthesis, which is the hardest part. Try and use to assemble your information in different ways to create a new picture of it. A literature review is different from an annotated bibliography. I've seen papers published which are annotated bibliographies. An annotated bibliography will say, reviewer, article 1 said this, article 2 said this, article 3 said this. They're basically taking individual papers and describing what's in each one, not synthesis. Writing the literature review, oh look, I think we're getting on. There's many ideas, but certainly I would suggest you try and find some software to support your literature review. Don't do it on a bit of paper. Add all your data into EndNote or Mendeley, it's free. There's many free bits of software available. So try and use some software to support it. oh, these are some ideas about writing, which I'll start. But remember, when you're writing any paper, you're not writing for everyone. You're trying to write and tell some specific people who are I mean, in any topic, there's probably 20, 50 people around the world who are interested in it, who actually know anything about it. And so your aim in writing a literature review or any paper is to know that you are writing for those people. And when you write a literature review, you might be thinking, I wonder if Noel Scott, when he reads this paper, will think I'm being stupid or not. Or I wonder if Professor so-and-so, what they will think. And so the best way, I'm not particularly good at this, but the best way of adding to a conversation or adding a conversation with particular authors is to clearly tell them that you understand what the previous research has already said. Okay? So be polite to people and you'll get your papers more easily accepted into a journal. And so I will leave it there. Thank you. That's a lot of stuff, but hopefully that was useful for people.
Thank you, Prof. Noel Scott, for insightful topic, a very insightful topic. Interestingly, you highlight the value of theory in academics and the relationship it has with real-world application. This topic has been debated many times on what is the contribution of the theory. Very often, research or the theory from the academic field only view or deserve to be on the shelf collecting dust. Thank you for your fresh perspective. Okay, to all attendees, if you have any question related to today's webinar, feel free to post on the chat box. Our team will pick up the questions and will read your questions.
Shall I, what would you like me to do?
Do you want me to read the question to you, or do you want to read from the chat box?
Whatever you think, Juan. You've been very good to me and answered good questions, so I don't mind.
Okay, I read the question for you. Right? Okay, we have a few good questions here. Okay, the first question comes from Gao Jian Hong. Prof, in your opinion, what is the good synthesizing when you are doing the systematic review, and what is good discussion in systematic review? Could you minding share some skills?
Oh, look, I think it took me a long time to really understand what synthesis means. What would be an example? Perhaps synthesis is a way of saying you see the forest, not the trees. So there's a proverb, you know, you see so it's the big picture. So to me, I always like to think about things like in a hierarchy. So this paper, you can think about that paper individually, but in fact, that paper shares some similarities to this paper. And, this paper shares some similarities to those other papers. And so what you can start to do is not think about each paper individually, but think about groups of papers which share similarities and differences. And then you don't talk about these particular trees, this one's the same, that one's different. You say within this forest, there are two groups of trees. Do you see? So you're starting to move away from an individual paper to groups of papers which share some similarities, and then perhaps compare those to another group which are different. And so if in this group of papers you're reading, you look at them and you think, well, what's all this mess about? And then you start to think and you say, okay, oh, many papers are talking about this concept. And then there are two different types of papers. Those papers that have examined antecedents of that concept, and those papers that have looked at consequences of that concept. And so already you've got two different types. You can look at antecedents and consequences of a particular concept, and then you can say, oh, and when I look at the antecedents, there are many different antecedents. And oh, there are many different consequences. So one really useful model to use to think about synthesis is to synthesize a group of papers based on antecedents and consequences. Oh, so that's one model to move from individual papers to some grouping which makes, and you see, if you looked at antecedents and consequences, you can justify that you have made a contribution to knowledge because no one's done that before. And you're developing a conceptual framework which says, well, all of these papers individually have studied these things. They're all related to this. And now I've summarized it all in this little diagram. Oh, synthesis. But that's just one way. Another way might be to do an historical analysis and show that over time, papers have changed from this way to this way to this way. Is that useful? I don't know. What about studying a particular phenomena? Ecotourism, right? Now, when you think about ecotourism, early papers, they just described ecotourism or something. Then people started to think, well, how many people are ecotourists? And then they started to look at ecotourism in different locations. And so again, you can see some pattern in the overall literature. Historical analysis, changing theories, changing assumptions. Some people might have thought, there's lots of different ways, but that's finding those groups of papers and comparing and contrasting them is the first step towards synthesis. Thank you. I can't hear you.
Thank you, Prof, for the answer. I have another question from Nur Hidayah Cik Ahmad. Yeah? Most journals accept empirical research paper. What about the potential of review paper, potential of review type of papers to be accepted by high-ranked journals? Can you share some tips on how to write a good review paper?
Okay, well, first of all, when people think about the value of an academic paper, you can rank, I think, you can rank papers in terms of their contribution. And a good literature review is usually considered the highest level of contribution. But it has to be a good literature review. We're not talking about a systematic review which counts papers. We're talking about a literature review which says, hey, all of these ideas, these 1,000 papers that people have written, all of that can be summarized and synthesized into this particular conceptual diagram. Wow, isn't that wonderful? Huh? How to write one? Well, I don't think you can write a good literature review until you know and have read and become familiar with the literature. That's the first step. And and that's why writing a literature review is one of the first steps in doing a PhD. Because in order to do a PhD, you need to understand your literature and to make sense of it. And that takes time. Think back, perhaps, I'm sure the professors and doctors who are listening will think back to the time that when they started their PhDs and how confusing it was to start reading all this rubbish in the literature and trying to make sense of it all. You go crazy. But the good thing about our minds is that over time, our brain tends to sort that out and we start to make sense of this literature. So writing a good literature usually means you have a in-depth and profound or good knowledge of the relevant literature and can see different types of papers. Once you can do that, then you can start to write a good literature review.
Thank you, Prof. Okay, we have another question. Okay, do you think utilizing secondary metadata is considered a review or research paper?
Well, that's interesting. You see, so for example, I was talking about citation analysis or bibliographic, various types of bibliographic. That's what you might call analysis of secondary data about a paper, right? Metadata. Now, metadata can be really useful in developing theories about how a discipline grows. So there are some theories, for example, the paradigm funnel idea. So you could do a very interesting study of metadata to prove or disprove the paradigm funnel theory. Okay, that's good. But that's not about the discipline, or that's not about the field, right? It's about how the field is developing. Similarly, the number of papers or the main authors is an interesting information about how the field is developing, but it's not about the theory, right? The metadata doesn't tell you the theory, and it doesn't prove anything about theory. It just proves that these people are talking about things, for example. So metadata can be useful for some things, and it can be interesting to read, but not interesting in terms of providing a contribution to theory about the theory of the field. Oh, well, that's not quite true. I mean, you can look at metadata perhaps by looking at keywords if they talk about the theory that's used. All right. Well, you might be able to say from that metadata that the theories that are used are of these types. But in itself, that's not useful. You then have to analyze and tell people what that means. So no, I think metadata is useful, but for some things, not for what I'm talking about.
Okay, another question. The word novel has a specific criteria to be met. Then only can be used to describe our contribution to the knowledge that question marks.
Okay, so when you say a thing has made a paper is novel, really what you're saying is that the paper has made a contribution, because by definition, a contribution is novel. It's new. Okay, so when you analyze and synthesize a paper and produce and write it down, and you identify, my theory has made this contribution, the contribution has to be novel in some way. It has to be new, but that's not the only requirement for a contribution. Another contribution is it has to be significant, right? So maybe my name is, I've got some funny name, that's new, but just because it's new doesn't mean it's significant, right? For academics. Does that make sense?
Okay, another question. Yeah, I would like to know from your point of view, how do you know that you have exhausted the research for a particular literature review? When is enough? When is enough enough? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's sort of like the question about if you're doing a qualitative series of interviews, how do you know when to stop? Okay, because you could keep on going and interview 1,000 people and maybe pick up some new piece of information. But typically you can't, you haven't got enough time. So, of course, in some areas, you can define it so tightly that there are only 50 papers. Right? In other areas, you could go for a long time. But remember, the point is you're not trying to identify every paper. You're trying to identify papers within groups. Okay, so within every group, let's say consumer behavior, there'll be millions of papers. But you might be interested in dividing all those papers into two types. And typically, someone will have already thought about that. Someone will have said, we can think about consumer behavior in these types of areas. And the only new thing that you would do is if you identified some new area that no one else had thought about, right? But if they have already identified those areas, you don't need to read every paper. You can just say, oh, well, those were the areas at the time, and now there's this new one. So no, there's this confusion. Remember, out of every 1,000 papers, there'll be, what, 10 different types? That's what you're analyzing. You see? So the key thing is to read other reviews to see how people have done it. Read the beginning of papers, because the introduction to a paper usually says, this is the topic, this is how other people have studied it, and this is how I'm going to study it, and this is the problem. That's a good introduction. Do you understand? And so if you're reviewing papers, people will have given you their idea of how the area is arranged in the introduction or in their literature reviews. And so you don't have to read every paper, but if you read enough, you'll start to see, well, these are the main things that people talk about. Mm-hmm.
We have another question from Sumaya Muhammad Rahman. Do we need to conduct quality assessment in scoping review?
So remember I said that a scoping review is of great interest when you're beginning a research project, but it's not usually publishable. Okay, so a scoping review is well, what quality assurance would you use to understand scoping reviews? You see, a scoping review is a initial look at an area that and usually is the basis for further focusing. Okay, So I suppose the main, in a scoping review, what I would be looking for are previous reviews, interesting papers, papers which describe the parts of the thing in order to me to narrow down further. And so the outcome I would be looking for is the identification of a more narrow area to study. Does that make sense?
I think that's it. Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Noy Scott, for a great session on writing a literature review. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you. And I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Thank you, Prof. Noel, for a wonderful talk on how to publish a good papers. I really learned a lot from the literature, how to write a good literature, actually. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll go now, and thank you very much. And I hope to see you in Australia or in Malaysia soon, once we can travel. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Dr.
Now,
Wan, Dr. Wan, what is the next agenda?
Is speech from KPP.
All right, then. Okay.
Now, I would like to welcome Associate Professor Dr. Hashim Fazil Arifin, Head of Center Faculty of Hotel and Tourism Management, Universiti Teknologi Mara Cawangan, Pulau Pinang, to deliver his closing speech. Please welcome.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Wan. Yang berbahagia Profesor Teknologis Dr. Salmiah Kasalang, Rector of Universiti Teknologi Mara Cawangan, Pulau Pinang. Associate Professor Dr. James Eric Gaskin from Brigham Young University, USA. Professor Dr. Noel Scott from University of Sunshine Coast, Australia. Lecturers and students from Faculty of Hotel and Tourism Management, UITM, Pulau, Malaysia. Lecturers and students from National Institute of Administration and Development, Thailand. Lecturers and students from King Mongkut Institute of Technology, Lakrabang, Thailand. Lecturers and students from Forum Program Studi Pendidikan Tata Boga, Indonesia. Lecturers and students from all over the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the organizing committee, we would like to express our sincere appreciation on your attendance to this webinar. We have had approximately 400 participants from all over the globe. I would like to point out 3 selling points from today's webinar. Number 1, the ability to do research and use it intelligently in writing is a basic tool of any educated person. Number 2, in today's knowledge economy, more and more people are using research skills in their daily work. And the last point, lastly but not least, understanding how to analyze, evaluate, criticize, combine, and draw conclusions from information sources is crucial to everyday decisions. On the other note, please visit our IJCHT official website and Facebook on the latest updates on the webinar series and the conference later on September this year. So folks, let's start writing and being published. Till then, hasta la vista, Hasta luego. Ciao. Assalamualaikum.
Thank
Over
you,
to you, Dr. Wan.
Yeah, thank you, Associate Professor Dr. Hashim Fadil Arifin. To all audiences from University Teknologi Mara, please scan the QR code shown on the screen for your e-certificate. For UITM staff, we register your attendance for training hours. Thank you for your participation in this webinar and hope to see you again in another series. Thank you.
I cannot see the barcode. Have you shared? Attendance barcode. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for your time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Well done. That's wonderful.
Hope to see you next time.
Well done.
Is that Dr. Ibu Lutfia?
There are like 300 participants. So many questions. Wonderful. I do not know FB. How many in FB and the other YouTube?
Prof, approximately 400 plus, Prof. Altogether, Facebook and Zoom 400 plus.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. It's a big conference.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.